Hi, everybody. Tonight we begin a gentle wander through the misty corridors of time to uncover the quiet truths behind one of history's most whispered mysteries. What really caused the downfall of Rome? This is not a tale of battles alone, nor only of emperors and marble pillars, but a soft unraveling of centuries, of ordinary lives folded into the grandeur of an empire that seemed too vast to crumble, yet crumble it did. So lie back, close your eyes if you wish, and let us drift together into the shadows of Rome's decline. Long ago, when the world was still stitched together by the slow pace of sandals and the glow of oil lamps, Rome was not merely a city but a promise, an idea that roads could bind the world, that law could tame wildness, that marble and mosaic could outlast the dust of ages. Yet under that marble skin, subtle cracks were forming, almost invisible to the eyes of those who strolled through the forum or bathed in the warm pools of the Thermae. In the beginning, Rome rose not on conquest alone, but on a strange, persistent gift for absorbing what it touched. It took the gods of the Greeks and gave them Latin names. It borrowed knowledge from the East, brought in slaves who became tutors, artists, cooks, and lovers. The empire was a sponge soaking up the world, but perhaps in that swelling lay the seed of its undoing. Tonight, though, we shall stand on a single street in a single evening, just as the sun has dipped behind the 7 hills. Imagine a narrow lane near the Suburra, the bustling neighborhood where the common people lived. Artisans, bakers, merchants, and thieves. The air is heavy with the smell of fresh bread, of sweat and spilled wine, of 1,000 candles flickering behind thin shutters. Here, the empire feels less like marble and more like beating hearts and aching backs. A boy named Lucius darts through the alleyways, his tunic stained with flour from the bakery where he works. He does not think of empire. He thinks of whether there will be enough bread tomorrow, whether his mother's cough will quiet before dawn. Yet Lucius is Rome, far more so than the senators draped in purple on the Palatine Hill. It is on his thin shoulders that the empire truly rests. As Lucius runs, he passes by a tavern door flung wide, spilling laughter and the rattle of dice onto the stones. Inside, old veterans trade tales of the frontier, of frost-bitten nights in distant Britannia, of Parthian arrows that darken the sky. They speak with pride, yet behind their words trembles a question they do not say aloud. How long can the legions hold so many borders? When each winter seems colder, each year brings more shadows beyond the walls. Nearby, in a dim room above the street, a woman named Marcia tends to her tiny garden of herbs. She learned the secrets of these plants from her mother, who learned them from a Greek midwife brought to Rome as spoils of an ancient war. Marcia's fingers crush mint and rue, lavender and sage, whispering prayers to household gods to guard her child's dreams. She, too, is Rome, hidden, ordinary, irreplaceable. Far above them all, in the marble halls of the Senate, men gather by torchlight to argue over taxes, over who will build the next aqueduct, over whose son will marry whose daughter. They do not see Lucius or Marcia or the veterans below. They write laws with elegant strokes of ink, never noticing how the parchment curls at the edges with damp from leaky roofs left unfixed in the Suburra. Outside the city walls, beyond the flickering torches of the watchtowers, shadows gather, tribes and peoples Rome once called barbarians. They press closer each season, not always with spears, but with wagons and hungry children. Some slip inside the empire as soldiers for hire. Others come to trade or to beg for land. Rome opens her gates, for she needs their strength to guard her roads, her frontiers, her endless hunger for grain and gold. Yet with every open gate, something shifts. New tongues echo in the markets, new gods share space with Jupiter and Mars. The sponge soaks more and more and more. In the taverns, the old veterans mutter that these new arrivals do not fight as Romans should. In the Senate, the word citizen grows slippery, stretched thin across a patchwork of tribes who bow to Rome but do not kneel in their hearts. Still, in this quiet night, none of this feels like doom. It feels like life. Messy, noisy, full of breath and laughter and argument. Lucius will sleep tonight on a straw mat beside his mother. Marcia will blow out her lamp and dream of a good harvest. The veterans will stumble home, drunk on wine and memories. The senators will retire to their villas, convinced they have all the time in the world. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the city sigh as it settles into darkness. a sigh that drifts down the Tiber and out across provinces so wide they make the stars look small. The empire sleeps, its heart beating in marble and flesh alike, never suspecting that somewhere, in the hush of time's turning wheel, small choices and hidden cracks have already begun the long work of undoing stone and glory alike. So sleep now, gentle dreamer, and when you wake we shall walk further, into the palace intrigues, the restless legions, and the whispering winds that carried Rome's fate across centuries. For tonight, let the city rest, and keep your dreams soft and still as the first threads of this grand unraveling slip through our waiting hands. When dawn breaks over Rome, it does not come all at once, but creeps softly across the tiled rooftops, slipping between columns and cloaking the narrow streets in a pale hush. Lucius is awake before the first rooster calls, kneeling beside the tiny hearth where the last embers of the night's fire glow like buried rubies. His mother sleeps, wrapped tight in a threadbare blanket, her breath raspy but steady for now. He stirs a pot of thin porridge, counting each spoonful of grain as if it were gold. Outside, the city stirs too. The streets echo with the clatter of cartwheels, the bray of donkeys, the low calls of vendors setting up stalls near the forum. Rome lives in these sounds, a restless giant that never truly sleeps, only shifts from dream to waking and back again. At the bakery, Lucius stands on a small wooden crate to reach the heavy table. He kneads dough under the sharp eye of Marcus, the baker, whose arms are thick as tree trunks, dusted white with flour. The air is warm with the rising scent of bread that feeds senators and slaves alike. As Lucius works, he listens to Marcus speak of shortages, of grain shipments delayed by storms on the sea, of taxes that squeeze the merchants tighter with each passing month. Too many mouths, Marcus grumbles, folding dough into perfect rounds. Too many roads to guard, and those up on the hill, they'll bleed us dry before they give up their feasts. Lucius does not answer. He does not know how to speak of such things. He only knows that the bread must rise, must bake, must feed the city that never seems to have enough. Still, a small seed of worry lodges in his chest, an unease he does not yet have words for. Meanwhile, high above in a villa perched on the Aventine Hill, Senator Publius Claudius Varus wakes to the taste of fine wine still lingering on his tongue from the night before. Slaves pull back the curtains, letting in the first golden threads of morning light. He reclines on his couch, dictating letters to a scribe, letters meant to remind governors in distant provinces of their duties, their debts, their promises to Rome. Publius believes in Rome's eternal nature, as all senators must. Yet even he feels a shadow when he thinks of the frontiers. Reports arrive, whispers of legions stretched thin, of barbarian kings bargaining for gold instead of fearing the eagle's standard. But Publius shrugs it off. Such things have happened before, and always Rome has prevailed. Rome must prevail. For what else is there if marble and law cannot hold back the wild edges of the world? By midday, the forum hums like a hive. Merchants shout their wares, spices from the east, silk, baskets of olives, clay amphorae filled with oil. There are foreigners everywhere now, Gauls with their bright cloaks, Syrians with dark eyes and softer speech. Some settle here, marrying Roman girls, offering tribute to Roman gods alongside their own. To many, this mingling is proof of Rome's glory, a sign that the world bends before her roads and legions. But among the old patricians, a quiet unease flickers. They see new faces in the Senate, new names on the rolls of citizenship. They grumble that Roman blood must remain pure, that Rome is no longer Rome if it forgets its Latin tongue, its sturdy virtues, its iron will. In a shaded corner of the forum, two veterans meet again by chance. One, Flavius, has a limp from a spear wound taken in Dacia. The other, Gaius, lost 3 fingers to frostbite in the northern forest Germania. They clasp arms in greeting, and for a moment they are young again, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the banners of the empire. But the moment passes quickly. They speak of pensions unpaid, of sons who will never know discipline of the old legions, of whispers that new recruits come not from Roman farms, but from tribes bribed with land and gold. It was not like this, Flavius says, eyes narrowing as if staring down an enemy line. Once we were feared. Now they laugh behind our backs. And yet, Gaius says softly, the roads still hold, the walls still stand. For how long? Flavius asks, but neither man has an answer. As the sun climbs higher, heat shimmers from the stones. Lucius leaves the bakery, carrying a basket of bread to deliver to the Suburra. The streets here are tight, the buildings leaning together as if whispering secrets. He passes beggars with hollow eyes, stray dogs nosing through refuse, children who watch him with envy as he clutches the warm loaves. In one shadowed doorway, an old man sits with a wooden bowl, his tunic ragged. Lucius pauses, breaking off a crust and dropping it into the bowl. The man's eyes glisten with gratitude, though he says nothing. Lucius walks on, the basket lighter, his heart strangely heavier. By evening, torches flicker along the main roads. Senators dine on roasted peacock and sweet wine. Poets gather in candlelit rooms to recite verses of Rome's greatness, while in cramped insulae, families crowd together, whispering prayers to keep sickness away. In the taverns, rumors grow louder, of bribes paid to barbarian chiefs, of generals who plot more for themselves than for Rome, of gold flowing out faster than it comes in. Yet still, when night settles once more, Rome looks eternal. The marble temples gleam under the moon. The aqueducts carry fresh water to the baths. The legions stand watch on distant rivers, their campfires tiny sparks against the dark forests beyond. But in the spaces between those sparks, where roads fade into wild, where borders are only lines in the minds of men, change is coming. Quiet, steady, like water wearing down stone. Lucius dreams of warm bread and his mother's soft breathing. Senator Publius dreams of power unchallenged. The old veterans dream of the days when Rome's name alone could hush the world. And somewhere out beyond the walls, a cold wind stirs through foreign camps, where chieftains whisper of weakness, of wealth waiting to be taken, of walls that might one day fall. But for now, the city sighs again, drifting into another night, never knowing how close the dusk lies to the dawn of something new. Something no law, nor legion, nor marble temple can hold back forever. In the hush of early dawn, the city holds its breath as the first carts creak through the gates, bringing produce from the surrounding countryside, vegetables, wine, salted fish. On the outskirts, where villas give way to open fields and humble farms, an old farmer named Tullius stands in his vineyard, fingers rough with calluses, eyes squinting against the pale light. He watches the vines with a kind of worry that feels older than Rome itself. Years ago, this land fed 100 mouths. Now the soil feels tired, as if it too has grown weary of feeding a city that never stops asking for more. Tullius remembers when his sons helped him harvest. One fell in battle on the northern frontier, his body never returned. Another left for the city, chasing coins and cheap promises. Now Tullius works with hired hands. Slaves bought from traders who bring their human wares from lands so far away, their names sound like soft rain when spoken. Yet even these slaves are harder to come by now, costlier than before. Wars that once brought endless captives have slowed, and the estates of the wealthy grow larger, devouring the small farms like wolves. Tullius feels it in his bones. The countryside is hollowing out. There are fewer farmers each season, more empty cottages swallowed by wild grass. Farther down the road, a young girl named Livia walks barefoot along the edge of a dusty path, balancing a clay jug of water on her head. Her family tends a small olive grove, clinging to land that generations have worked. She hears her father's voice in the evenings, low and tense, telling her mother how the taxes keep rising. The collectors arrive with soldiers at their side, and the weight of empire presses down even on the tiniest plots of earth. She has never seen the marble temples of Rome, never tasted the sweet pastries her father remembers from market days in the city. Yet Livia feels the empire's pull with each coin her father hides in a cracked jar, each olive plucked before it is ripe enough to earn a few extra denarii. Meanwhile, within the city's crowded heart, Lucius wakes to a dull ache in his legs. Yesterday's work lingers in his bones, but there is bread to knead, deliveries to make. He steps out into a street that feels tighter every day, more people squeezed into the same crooked lanes, more mouths searching for scraps. He watches a group of newcomers standing near the market wall, tall, broad-shouldered men with pale hair and foreign words spilling from their lips. They wear simple tunics, some patched with Roman cloth. Their eyes flick across the city with a quiet hunger that is not for food alone, but for something harder to name. Lucius has heard the whispers. These are foederi, barbarian tribes allowed to settle within Rome's borders in exchange for their swords and their sons in the legions. Some call it clever policy, others call it poison in the veins. Lucius only knows that more strangers now share the streets, the wells, the bread. Sometimes they fight with local boys. Sometimes they stand in tight knots at dusk, murmuring in harsh consonants that carry across the alleyways. In the forum, Senator Publius stands on a marble step, voice lifted in a practiced cadence. Around him, a circle of lesser nobles and merchants nod and mutter approval. He speaks of unity, of Rome's unmatched power, of the wisdom in welcoming new blood to guard the borders. Yet when the speech ends and the crowd drifts away, Publius feels a pinch of fear in his chest. He has read the letters from the provinces, settlements burned, garrisons pleading for reinforcements that never come. He remembers the old stories his father told him, of the Punic Wars when Rome's will could bend the world. But that Rome seems a ghost now, flickering behind the veil of marble facades and brittle pride. Still, what else can he do but stand firm, repeat the words that hold back the rising tide? In the cramped Suburra, Lucius returns home late, the last light of dusk washing his street in a dull copper glow. His mother sits by the hearth, stirring a thin stew of cabbage and old bones. She tries to smile when she sees him, but her breath catches in her throat, a cough rattling deep in her chest. He sets down a piece of bread beside her bowl, pretending not to notice how she breaks it into tiny pieces, making it last. Above them, in a room barely large enough for a bed, Marcia tends to her herbs. She knows which roots soothe fever, which leaves ease a cough. She has seen sickness creep through the Suburra before, how fast it slips from house to house when the rains come, how cruelly it chooses its victims. She wraps bundles of dried lavender and thyme, leaving them at doorways when no one is looking. A small kindness in a city that has forgotten how to care for its own. And still, every night, the city lights its torches. The watchmen patrol the walls, the senators dine by lamplight. Caravans arrive through the gates, bearing silk and spices, news from distant deserts and misty forests. All seems well to the eyes that wish to see it so. But the cracks widen beneath the marble streets. Farmers drift away from the fields, driven out by debt and taxes they cannot pay. They crowd into Rome's belly, swelling its population, but bringing with them only hunger and empty hands. The great estates prosper, feeding fat nobles and selling grain at prices that starve the poor. In the barracks, new recruits speak Latin with broken tongues. Some are loyal, some are not. Who can tell in the cold before dawn when a sentry's eyes grow heavy and a gate swings wide for a silver coin? Yet tonight, all these threads are hidden in the city's dreaming. Tullius falls asleep beneath his vineyard's fading vines. Livia curls beside her mother on a straw pallet. Lucius listens to his mother's cough grow softer as she drifts to uneasy sleep. And beyond the walls, the whispering winds carry rumors across the dark plains, rumors of new leaders rising among the restless tribes, of old grudges rekindled like embers beneath snow. Rome dreams on, unaware of how thin the line grows between its restless present and the shadows gathering to claim it. When the sun next climbs over the city's rooftops, its warmth seems to linger on the stones as if Rome herself needs the comfort. Along the Via Appia, carts laden with amphorae of oil and wine trundle toward the gates. The city guards wave them through with hardly a glance, weary eyes dulled by long nights and the weight of too many questions left unspoken. On a small farm near Capua, far from the Senate's marble shadows, Livia's father, Gaius Severus, kneels in his grove, fingers buried in the dry earth. His olive trees stand thin and spindly this year, their roots thirsting for rain that never seems to come. He lifts his eyes to the sky, finds only a pale blue dome stretching endlessly overhead. No clouds, no promise. At the edge of the grove, Livia watches him. She knows what he fears, though he rarely says it aloud, that the taxes will claim more than the land can give, that the collectors will arrive with records written by hands that have never felt this earth, never stooped to tend a root or mend a dry stone wall. She wants to ask him what will happen if the olives fail, if the coins run out. But instead she says nothing, only clutches the rough bark of a tree, as if to anchor herself to something older and stronger than worry. Back within the city walls, Lucius hurries through the Suburra with a small bundle of bread wrapped in coarse cloth. His mother's cough worsened in the night. Marcia's herbs brought some relief, but the fever lingers like an unwelcome guest. Lucius slips through crowded alleys, past washing lines strung with patched tunics, past doorways where weary eyes watch him with quiet suspicion. He stops before Marcia's door, hesitates, then knocks gently. Inside, the air is heavy with the smell of dried mint and burning rosemary. Marcia greets him with a tired smile, wiping her hands on her apron. She looks older today, as if the shadows of 100 small worries have settled into the lines beside her eyes. "She'll need broth," Marcia murmurs, checking the bundle of bread. "And warmth. The city grows cold when the wind turns from the north." Lucius nods. He wants to ask if his mother will live, but the words stick in his throat. He has learned, already, that Rome does not pause for sickness, nor for grief. Bread must still be baked, coins must still be earned. So he thanks Marcia, ducks his head, and slips back in the maze of streets where merchants bark prices and children dart like sparrows through the crowds. Far above the Suburra, in a villa overlooking the Circus Maximus, Senator Publius Claudius Verus reclines beside a mosaic fountain, listening to his secretary read a letter brought in haste from the northern border. The words speak of unrest, bands of tribes pushing closer to the limes, the great fortified line meant to keep Rome's enemies at bay. Publius frowns, swirling watered wine in a shallow cup. He thinks of the coins already spent bribing chiefs to keep peace, the legions stationed far too thinly along too many rivers. "Send more gold," he says, almost absently, waving his secretary away. Promised land. Promised citizenship. It has worked before. Yet when he is alone, he stands and crosses the cool marble floor to his private study. There he opens a chest and lifts a tarnished bronze helmet, his grandfather's, worn at the Battle of Actium long before Publius drew breath. He runs a finger along its battered crest, imagining a Rome that once fought because it must, not because it could be bought. He wonders if that Rome still lives somewhere beneath the layers of coin and compromise. In the barracks near the city's eastern gate, soldiers gather around a small fire, the smell of stew rising to mingle with the sharp tang of oiled armor. Many of these men are not Roman by birth. They wear the eagle on their tunics, swear oaths in rough Latin, but among themselves they speak in tongues brought from cold forests and broad plains beyond the Danube. Some are loyal, some only hungry for coin and a patch of Roman soil to call their own. One man, a young recruit named Armin, holds his cloak tighter as the night creeps in. He remembers his father's tales of Roman swords that cut down his people's warriors, of treaties broken and grudges passed from father to son. He wonders sometimes if he too will break his oath one day, if hunger or pride or the lure of old vengeance will drown out the promise he made to Rome's officers. Yet for now, he stands watch on the wall, spear in hand, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the flickering torches. He sees only the slow drift of mist rising from the Tiber, the silhouettes of traders arriving late, the quiet shapes of beggars curling beneath the arches to sleep. And beneath this restless city, the cracks deepen. Grain grows costlier, wine flows more freely, coins change hands in back rooms where senators whisper secrets. Small riots spark when bread runs short, quickly put down by soldiers paid just enough to care. The countryside empties into the city's belly, each new mouth another tug on an already frayed cord. Yet every morning, Rome wakes again. The forum bustles with merchants and philosophers and thieves alike. The baths fill with laughter and gossip. Children run barefoot over ancient stones. The temples ring with prayers offered to gods who watch from cold marble pedestals, silent as ever. And in a cramped room above a quiet alley, Lucius listens to his mother's breathing, counts the seconds between her coughs, and wonders if tomorrow will be kinder. Far from him, in an olive grove where the earth cracks beneath a relentless sun, Livia's father digs deeper, hoping roots will find what rain has denied. And somewhere beyond Rome's walls, in camps where fires burn low and chieftains murmur in the dark, plans take shape like distant thunder, unseen yet inevitable, drawn ever closer by the quiet hunger that no empire, however vast, can keep at bay forever. By the time dusk settles over Rome once more, the city feels as though it exhales a long, weary breath. Torches flicker to life along the Via Sacra, and shadows slip across the ancient stones, carrying secrets from one corner of the empire to another. On this night, Lucius sits beside his mother's pallet, the glow of a single clay lamp casting soft pools of light on the cracked walls of their narrow room, Her breath rattles like dry leaves caught in a gutter. He dips a cloth into a bowl of cool water and lays it gently on her forehead, whispering small comforts that vanish into the hollow space between them. He does not know that Marcia, 2 doors down, watches her own candle burn low as she grinds more herbs for the sick who cannot pay. She wraps small bundles in scraps of linen, leaving them at doorsteps before dawn, each parcel a quiet rebellion against the city's indifference. Outside, Rome murmurs with life. In taverns near the Circus Flaminius, soldiers and merchants crowd wooden tables sticky with spilled wine. Dice clatter, laughter breaks like a wave, and beneath it all flows the low current of rumor. Word has spread that another tribe has crossed the Danube, pressing into lands where Roman farmers once plowed furrows under legionary protection. Some say it means nothing. These peoples always come and go, leaving Rome untouched. Others remember darker tales whispered by old men who once rode with legions into frozen forests, that these newcomers do not leave so easily. In a lamplit corridor of the Senate House, Publius Claudius Varus stands before a marble relief of Romulus and Remus, the wolf suckling them beneath the fig tree. The senator's sandals click softly on the cold stone floor as he paces, waiting for his fellow patricians to gather. Tonight, they will argue again over funds. How many denarii to send to the frontiers, how much grain to requisition, how many concessions to offer the chiefs who demand land within Rome's embrace. When the doors finally open, Publius lifts his chin, masking his weariness with practiced poise. The chamber hums with polite hostility. Old rivals nod curtly, scribes sharpen their quills, and the flickering torchlight paints every face with the same weary pallor. A senator from Gaul stands to speak first, his Latin thick with an accent that some still mock behind closed doors. He argues for greater gifts to the Foederati tribes. These allies, he insists, are cheaper than legions and just as loyal when fed. Publius listens, fingers drumming the marble balustrade. He knows the truth behind the smooth words. Rome has grown too wide, too thin. Each province cries out for soldiers who no longer exist in numbers enough to fill every watchtower. The old bloodlines that once filled the legions with sons have turned to softer lives, preferring villas, books, and politics to the cold bite of iron. When Publius's turn comes, he speaks of Rome's unbroken spirit, of the need for caution, of balancing bribes with discipline. He calls for new roads to bind the provinces tighter, for fresh taxes to fund more recruits. But behind his steady voice lurks the same unspoken question that coils in every senator's mind. How long can we bribe the wolves at our door before they remember they have teeth? Far from marble walls and whispered bargains, Tullius the old farmer sits beneath his vines, a cup of sour wine balanced on his knee. The night hums with insects, the air still warm from the day's sun. He runs a thumb along the rim of the cup and thinks of seasons past when the harvest was good and the taxes bearable. He remembers when neighbors gathered to share jugs of wine under the moon, trading gossip and laughter instead of worries about collectors and soldiers demanding grain for distant garrisons. His dog, a mangy creature with a scarred ear, lies at his feet, ears flicking at every sound in the dark. Tullius leans back against a rough post, staring at the stars, unchanged, indifferent, eternal. He wonders if his vines will outlast him, or if weeds will claim the rose once his back can no longer bend to the work. In another corner of the empire, along the border where Roman forts rise like lonely sentinels, Armin, the young recruit, stands watch again. The wind from the forests carries the smell of pine and distant fires. He shifts his spear from one hand to the other, listening for the soft rustle of branches that might betray an approaching scout, or something worse. Beside him, an older legionary spits into the dirt, muttering that these woods were never quiet when he first marched here, years ago. Back then, the tribes feared Rome's banners, fled at the sound of iron striking shields. Now they linger closer each night, testing the lines, measuring the gaps between watchfires. Armin says nothing. He remembers his father's words, old grudges, old wrongs. He wonders if the gold Rome pays him now will matter when those old stories come calling. And in the hush before dawn, he almost thinks he can hear the heartbeat of a forest that has never truly surrendered. In the Suburra, Lucius drifts into a shallow sleep beside his mother's pallet. He dreams of bread ovens glowing warm and bright, of his mother's laugh when she was well, of streets that smelled of fresh loaves instead of sickness. But even in sleep, he feels Rome pressing down, its weight spread across every cracked wall, every unpaid debt, every whispered fear of strangers at the gates. Beyond the gates, fires burn in camps where new chiefs rise with hungry eyes. They speak in harsh tongues of lands promised and denied, of tribute paid but never enough, of Rome's walls that stand not by might alone, but by bargain struck with men who remember a time before the eagle's shadow fell on their fathers. Still, tonight the city sleeps, cloaked in illusions of strength. Temples bathed in moonlight, columns reaching skyward. Statues of emperors who ruled when the world trembled at a single command. And beneath this quiet marble skin, the true Rome stirs uneasily, blind to how thin the line has grown between what it was and what it has yet to become. Morning returns to Rome with a breath of chill that slips through every cracked tile and broken shutter. The city, ever restless, shivers awake. A thin mist clings to the Tiber's banks, drifting over stone bridges where merchants hurry with carts piled high with salted fish and dried figs. The river whispers secrets to those who care to listen, secrets carried from far-off hills and lonely frontiers where Rome's reach fades into rumor. In a cramped insula near the Suburra, Lucius stirs from broken dreams to find the oil lamp has long since burned itself to a stub of charred wick. His mother's breathing is shallow, her face turned to the wall as if she is already leaning toward a place he cannot follow. He stands slowly, careful not to wake her, though he knows that even if she wakes, she will not truly see him through the fever's fog. He pulls on his tunic and slips out into the street, basket in hand, ready to beg Marcus the baker for a day's work. The bread must still be baked, even when sorrow presses heavy on his shoulders. The scent of fresh loaves has always given him comfort, warmth in a city that so often feels cold despite its blazing hearths and crowded streets. Elsewhere, along the Via Latina, a caravan inches toward the gates. Oxen plod forward, their flanks ribbed and weary, dragging wagons loaded with bolts of eastern silk, amphorae of sweet Falernian wine, and crates of spices so pungent they perfume the dawn air. At the head of the line rides Cassius, a merchant whose fortunes have risen and fallen like the Tiber's tide. His beard is trimmed neat, his cloak newly mended, yet worry etches fine lines around his eyes. Cassius trades in luxuries for Rome's elite, cinnamon and pepper that make the mouths of senators water, silk that drapes their wives in colors stolen from distant kingdoms. But trade has grown fickle. Pirates plague the coasts, taxes squeeze every cargo until profit feels like a rumor told to children. And then there are the roads, safe enough once, now crowded with desperate men who have left their fields behind and turned to less honest means of living. At the city gate, Cassius nods to the guards, pressing a small purse into a waiting hand to speed the crossing. He knows the cost of delay is higher than the price of a bribe. As the caravan creaks into the city, his mind is already on the Senate. The whispers of new tariffs, the rumors of more gold demanded to pay soldiers who hold the borders with trembling fingers. In the forum, Senator Publius Claudius Varus stands among marble columns that gleam white and pure in the morning sun. Yet to Publius, they look like gravestones, silent reminders of men whose names are carved deep into Rome's skin, men who once believed they could bind the world with stone and law. Today, he listens as a Greek philosopher debates a young orator about virtue, about whether Rome's soul still burns bright beneath all the gilded rot. Publius wants to believe it does. He wants to believe the old stories, that the Senate is the heart of the Republic, that the Republic still breathes behind the Empire's vast mask. But each letter he receives from distant governors chips away at that faith. Pleas for more gold, more men, more promises to hold the line for just one more season. Near the philosopher's feet, a beggar woman sits with her back to a column, a thin child curled in her lap. She hums softly, her voice drowned by the orator's grand words. Publius catches her eye for a moment, just a flicker, and looks away. He cannot bear to linger on what he cannot fix. Beyond the city, on a stretch of land once fertile and green, Tullius stands beside a ditch he has dug with hands that crack and bleed. He curses under his breath at the stubborn earth that will not yield enough for taxes and family both. He glances at the road that winds toward Rome, half wishing he could walk it and never return. But who would tend the vines? Who would remember the rose planted by his father's father, the stones cleared by hands long returned to dust? His neighbor, old Flaccus, passes by with a cart piled high with the last of his grain. Flaccus nods but does not stop. There is nothing left to say. They both know the collectors will come, and if the grain is not enough, they will take goats, tools, the land itself. In Rome, senators boast of bounty and trade. Here, the fields know only hunger. And at the empire's bleeding edge, in a damp wooden watchtower half swallowed by forest, Armin stands guard again. Dawn paints the horizon in bruised gold. He holds his spear tighter when he hears movement in the trees. Just a fox, perhaps, or a scout from the tribes that circle like wolves beyond the fires. The older legionary at his side spits on the floorboards, muttering of home and warmth and wives waiting far away. But Armin says nothing of home. He has begun to wonder which side of the wall he truly belongs to, whether his oath binds him more to Rome's fading promise or to the blood that calls him back to forests untouched by marble and law. He thinks of the chieftains who gather in secret, promising lands for loyalty or steel for betrayal. He feels the line blur beneath his feet. In the Suburra, Lucius returns to his mother with a small loaf clutched tight to his chest. He sits beside her again, breaks off a piece, wets her lips with water, whispers that the sun is shining, that the streets are busy, that tomorrow will be better. He says these things softly, like prayers to old household gods who no longer listen. Outside, Rome roars on. Wheels rattle over cobblestones polished smooth by centuries of ambition and greed. Statues stand silent guard over streets teeming with laughter and arguments and quiet hunger. The marble glows white in the noon sun, but beneath it the cracks deepen, hidden from those who refuse to see how far the roots have rotted. Tonight, fires will flicker again in forests beyond the Danube. Chiefs will raise horns to the moon, sharpening blades in silence. And somewhere in the hush before sleep, Rome's people will dream, some of bread, some of land, some of power that cannot be bought or begged or stolen back once it has slipped through careless hands. When dusk falls once more, it drapes the city in a softer gold that lingers on marble facades and the weathered stones of the Suburra alike. The hush before true night is a fragile thing in Rome, fleeting, filled with murmurs that slip through cracks in doorways and echo down narrow lanes where torchlight trembles on damp walls. Inside the bakery, Lucius wipes flour from his hands as Marcus counts the day's coins behind the counter. The oven's warmth clings to Lucius's skin, a welcome shield against the creeping chill that seeps through the city as autumn whispers at Rome's door. For a moment, he lets himself lean against the wall, eyes closing as he listens to the gentle crackle of cooling embers. He thinks of his mother's shallow breath, the damp cloth on her brow, the tiny morsels of bread he tucks aside for her each evening. Marcus glances up, frowns at the boy's drooping shoulders. "Go on, then," he grunts. "Take that heel of loaf with you. She'll need it more than I do." Lucius murmurs his thanks, voice hoarse from hours of kneading and lifting sacks of grain. He slips back into the street, bread wrapped tight in linen, and begins the slow walk home through alleys that grow darker with each step. Around him, Rome hums with the restless promise of night, drunken laughter from taverns, the clink of dice against wooden boards, the sharp bark of dogs nosing through refuse. Beyond the clamor, the Senate House glows like a lantern. Within its walls, Senator Publius Claudius Verus stands alone before a map spread wide across a marble table. Tiny carved figures, legions, forts, and tiny wooden ships mark Rome's presence in lands that stretch far beyond what any single mind can truly hold. He studies the frontiers with a cold eye, tracing the lines where ink insists control, but truth murmurs otherwise. A soft knock breaks the silence. His secretary slips in, bowing low, a sealed letter in hand. Publius reads it by lamplight, another plea from a provincial governor, words weighed down with worry. More tribes gathering near the border, food stores dwindling, soldiers restless for pay that comes too late, too thin. He feels the letter grow heavier with each line, as though the parchment alone could crack the marble beneath his feet. He folds it carefully, lays it beside a stack of others, each a ghost of a promise that grows harder to keep. The map offers no comfort tonight. The tiny wooden eagles feel like fragile toys compared to the hunger gathering beyond the walls. Far from his lamplit study, on the edge of Rome's swelling shadows, Tullius tends a small fire beneath the naked branches of an old fig tree. The vineyard around him lies restless in the night breeze, leaves rattling like faint applause for a play whose final act no one wishes to see. He watches the flames dance low, warming his cracked hands. He thinks of his sons, one gone to the cold earth beneath a barbarian forest, the other lost somewhere in Rome's stone labyrinth. He wonders if the vines will stand when he no longer can, if these rows will become the bones of some new owner's fortune. He spits into the dust, more out of habit than anger. Around him, the fields feel emptier each season, neighbors leaving for the city, for soldiers' pay, for promises made by men who never stand in these same cold furrows. On the northern frontier, under a sky quilted with frost-kissed stars, Armin stands watch near the flickering palisade of a lonely fort. The forest presses close, branches creaking like whispers. He shifts his spear, eyes searching for shapes that do not belong. He thinks of his father's words, of a people driven back, forced to bend or break beneath Rome's iron heel. Now the sons of those same people wear Roman mail, swear oaths in Latin, guard borders that once cut through their grandfather's hunting grounds. Tonight, by the fire, a fellow soldier jokes about returning home rich, gold in his purse, a farm granted for loyal service. Armin only nods. He does not say aloud what stirs in his chest when he hears the wind slip through the trees in a tongue older than Rome itself. He wonders what loyalty truly costs when the coins run out, when the gates stand unmanned, when the forest creeps closer with each moon. Back in the Suburra, Lucius slips through his door, careful not to wake his mother. He sets the bread beside her pallet, watches her stir in a fevered half-dream, murmuring his father's name, long dead, lost to a scaffolding accident when Lucius was barely old enough to remember the scent of his tunic after long days in the sun. Lucius sits, back against the rough wall, listening to the city's distant murmurs. He dreams of better days without daring to close his eyes. Somewhere deep inside him, a question grows. What keeps Rome standing when so much seems so ready to crumble? Is it that the marble columns he has never touched, the senator's smooth words drifting above streets like his? Or is it this, the boy's hands, the mother's breath, the baker's crust shared without a second thought? Far above, in the hills where torchlight no longer dares reach, chiefs gather near fires that crackle low against the cold. They speak in rough tongues of promises broken and new roads to be carved not in stone, but in conquest. They weigh Rome's gold against their hunger and find the scales tipping swiftly in the wind's favor. Yet within the city walls, the statues remain. The temples stand quiet beneath the stars. Somewhere in a marble atrium, Publius stares down at his maps, whispering that tomorrow will hold. On the streets below, Lucius drifts to sleep against the wall, bread untouched beside his mother's fragile chest. And Rome, vast and restless, exhales once more, an empire wrapped in dreams that even now do not know how close they stand to waking. At dawn, a thin mist rolls over the Tiber, curling like pale smoke around the arches of the stone bridges that bind the city's heart to the distant hills. The river carries whispers, echoes of voices from the provinces, the frontiers, the old forests beyond the reach of Rome's restless grasp. In the quiet moment before the streets awaken, the city seems to dream still, caught between the hush of night and the slow grind of day. Lucius stirs where he has slept, back stiff from the cold press of the wall. He opens his eyes to the pale wash of morning light that slips through a cracked shutter and falls across his mother's face. Her breathing is softer now, so soft he holds his own breath for fear of missing its gentle rise and fall. He reaches to touch her brow, finds it damp but cooler than the night before. A thread of hope stirs in him, as fragile as the light that spills across the floor. He tears a piece from the loaf Marcus gave him and dips it in a cup of watered wine, coaxing her to swallow. She stirs, eyes fluttering open for a moment, finding his face as if from a far-off place. She tries to speak, but no words come. Lucius squeezes her hand instead, letting silence say what his voice cannot bear. Outside, Rome yawns awake. The streets fill with the slow rumble of carts bringing fish and olives from the coast, vegetables from the tired fields beyond the gates. Near the forum, hawkers call their prices, voices cutting the morning chill. Foreign tongues slip among the Latin, fragments of Gothic, hints of Germanic speech, scraps of Greek carried by traders from islands that sparkle like coins across the sea. In the forum itself, Senator Publius Claudius Varus walks briskly beneath the marble porticos, robes gathered close against the damp. He nods to fellow senators, exchanges polite words about grain shipments and new levies, but behind each greeting flickers a pulse of worry. A courier waits near the steps of the Senate House, a scroll tucked beneath his arm, wax seal still unbroken. Publius takes it with a curt nod, breaking the seal as he climbs the steps. The words inside make his heart stumble. Another outpost abandoned under cover of darkness, another band of Fotori defecting to join the swelling ranks of tribes pressing ever closer. Promises made in gold and land no longer bind, when the coffers empty faster than they fill. He thinks of his grandfather's helmet, still resting in his study, a relic of a time when Rome's legions were sons of her soil, not hired blades turned loose at the scent of silver. He wonders, as he often does now, if this is how an ending sounds. Not with a roar, but with a soft, steady retreat. Beyond the forum's stone embrace, in the wide courtyard of a wealthy merchant's villa, Cassius oversees the unloading of his caravan. Silk bolts gleam like spilled moonlight under the watchful eyes of household slaves. The spice crates breathe out their sharp perfume, cinnamon and cloves that whisper of far-off jungles and strange coastlines. Yet even as Cassius counts his profit, unease curls in his chest. Pirates have taken 2 ships this month, ships that carried goods promised to the wives of senators who pay him well for luxuries that taste like power. On the road from the coast, he lost 3 wagons to bandits desperate enough to strike, where once only legion patrols dared to ride. He rubs his thumb over a small bronze coin, its edges worn thin, and wonders how long profit will outrun the wolves gathering at Rome's frayed edge. In the Suburra, Marcia the herbalist pulls her shawl tight as she picks her way through the maze of alleys. She stops at doorways where sickness sleeps behind thin wood. Leaves small bundles of mint and thyme, a pinch of dried rosemary tied with frayed string. She has done this since she was a girl, learned it from her mother, who learned it from a Greek woman once dragged to Rome in chains and freed by kindness alone. She sees Lucius sitting by his mother's side when she stops at their door. She lays a gentle hand on his shoulder, places another bundle beside the cold hearth. She says nothing of payment. Marcia knows Rome's poorest have already paid enough in sleepless nights and empty bowls. Far beyond the city's hum, near the creeping fog of the northern forests, Armin stands by a low fire inside the palisade of his outpost. The older legionary beside him carves a piece of wood into the shape of a horse, whittling it smooth with a small blade more precious to him than the sword strapped to his belt. "You ever wonder if they'll come tonight?" the older man asks, not looking up. His voice drifts between the crackle of flames and the soft sigh of the trees. Armin does not answer at first. He watches the darkness beyond the wooden spikes, black pine trunks fading into mist, the hush of hidden paths. Somewhere out there, men like him gather around fires of their own, speaking his mother's tongue, sharpening blades not for hunting, but for reclaiming something they feel was never Rome's to keep. "They always come?" Armin says at last, his breath a ghost in the cold air. When the sky blushes with the first hint of dawn, Lucius rests his head beside his mother's hand. He dreams, if it can be called dreaming, of a Rome that is kind, where bread is warm and mothers do not fade like candlelight. He dreams of the Tiber clean and clear, of streets that do not choke on sickness or secrets. In the villa on the Aventine Hill, Publius stands at his window long after the lamps have burned low. He stares at the rooftops sprawled like a restless sea beneath him. He tells himself that Rome is too great to fall, too vast to break, too clever to be outwitted by the wild edges of the world. Yet when he closes his eyes, he sees cracks in the marble, hairline fissures running through statues and columns. And far off, in the hush before dawn, he thinks he hears it, like a faint drumbeat at the edge of sleep. An empire's heart, unsteady, struggling to remember how to keep its own pulse strong. When the sun rises the next day, its light spills over Rome like a veil half lifted, golden and soft at first, then harsh as it finds every crack, every weary corner the night failed to hide. The city wakes with 1,000 small groans, the grind of millstones turning, the creak of wagons on cobbled streets, the hiss of braziers coaxed back to life. each sound a heartbeat in the restless chest of an empire that does not yet know how close it stands to the edge. Lucius stands at the bakery door before dawn's full warmth finds the street. Marcus lets him in with a grunt, already elbow-deep in dough. The ovens glow, fat logs spitting sparks as they catch. The scent of yeast and ash fills the small room, wrapping Lucius in a comfort he cannot name. Here, within these walls, the world shrinks to the simple tasks of kneading, shaping, feeding the fires that in turn feed the city. Marcus watches him with a sideways glance, the old man's eyes shrewd but not unkind. He knows about the boy's mother. Word travels on hushed tongues in the Suburra. Without asking, he slips Lucius a heel of bread when the loaves are stacked, pretending not to notice the way the boy clutches it close, as though it were gold pressed warm into his palm. "Mind you, keep the fire fed," Marcus mutters. "If that oven cools, you'll be hauling wood till dusk." Lucius nods, grateful for the simple order. In work, he can forget for a time the thin walls of home, the shallow breath that drifts in and out like a tide that never quite returns full. Far from the bakery's warmth, in the cavernous shadows of the Senate House, Publius Claudius Varus listens as arguments rise like incense toward the painted ceiling. A senator from Hispania pounds a fist against a marble bench, voice raw with worry. Barbarians pressing into Gaul, fields left untilled, farmers fleeing taxes so heavy they would rather abandon their land than bend beneath the weight. Across the chamber, another voice, calm, measured, dangerous in its ease, counters with honeyed promises. The new foederati will fill the legions, guard the roads, swell the tax rolls once they settle. They will fight for Rome because Rome will make them Roman, or so the words insist. The reality lingers unspoken, trust built not on loyalty but on gold and thin oaths that fray with each unpaid coin. Publius says little. He has learned that words can carry too far in these walls, echo into the streets where rumor twists them into daggers. Instead, he watches the faces of men grown soft on privilege, men who speak of frontiers they have never seen, whose sons wear silks rather than armor, whose daughters marry into families that build wealth on grain and foreign luxuries, not on Roman steel. When the session breaks, he slips away through a side corridor. The marble beneath his sandals feels colder than it did when he was a boy, when he first traced his fingers over the carved names of consuls who bled for Rome. He wonders if his own name will survive on such stone, or if it will fade into dust when the walls come down. Beyond the city, in the brittle fields near Capua, Livia carries a basket along the rows of her father's olive trees. She stops to gather fallen branches for kindling, her bare feet pressing the dry soil that drinks the sun, but gives so little back. Her father's voice drifts from the grove behind her, low, cracked, muttering to himself as he inspects the thin clusters of olives clinging to branches that once drooped heavy with fruit. She remembers when neighbors came to help with the harvest, songs echoing through the hills as laughter rose with the dawn. Now, silence walks the rows with her, broken only by the caw of distant crows. At the edge of the grove, she sees a rider pass along the dusty road. A tax collector flanked by two soldiers, faces hidden beneath battered helmets. They do not glance her way, but the jingle of coin and the dull thud of hooves remind her that soon they will stop here too, weighing olives against debts that never shrink. Back near the northern forests, Armin wipes frost from the edge of his spear as dawn bleeds into day. The forest watches him, old trees bristling with secrets, shadows shifting like restless ghosts. His breath hangs in the chill air as he listens to the older legionary beside him grumble about pay that never arrives, about orders that make less sense each week. "They say the chiefs will keep the peace," the man mutters, spitting into the snow. "They say gold will buy their silence." Armin thinks of the men who gathered around hidden fires the last time he slipped through the trees under the moon's pale watch. Men who speak his tongue without shame, who promise not gold but land. Land once theirs, taken stone by stone, mile by mile, until only the forest remains to remember. He wonders which promise is stronger, Rome's coin or the soil underfoot. In the Suburra, Marcia leans over Lucius's mother, laying a fresh cloth soaked in rosemary water across her brow. She hums softly, half a lullaby, half a prayer to spirits she does not name aloud. When Lucius returns with the day's bread, Marcia touches his shoulder and says nothing, only nods once before slipping away into the dusk. Night creeps up the Tiber again, the river carrying scraps of song from taverns, the soft hush of secrets traded beneath arches where lovers meet and thieves count coins. In the forum, statues stand silent vigil, their stone eyes blind to the shadows gathering beyond the walls. Lucius lies beside his mother's pallet, the smell of fresh bread drifting up to meet the stale air of their narrow room. He listens to her breath, counts the seconds between each shallow rise and fall, and dreams of something simple. A morning when the oven's fire stays warm, when the walls do not crack, when the city beyond his door remembers him not as a burden, but as proof that it still lives. Far beyond the flickering lamps of Rome, a horn sounds in the forest, low, mournful, carried on a wind that does not stop at any border Rome can draw on a map. And somewhere in the hush that follows, an empire shifts in its sleep, never knowing how close its dreams lie to waking in the dark. Beyond the vine-wrapped villa walls and the winding roads that still bore the grooves of merchant carts, Rome in its late days breathed with a strange hush. A hush not of peace, but of a weariness too deep to voice. In this hush, the heart of the empire slowed, as if the pulse that had once drummed with legions and proclamations now found itself tangled in a net of small, unseen failures. And so, as the 10th night of our gentle telling begins, let us wander quietly through a tale of families who bore witness to this slow unraveling, not as emperors or generals, but as simple souls whose small stories made up the vast and fading tapestry. In a district by the old Forum, where columns crumbled like chalk under the sun's glare, there lived a candle maker named Lucilla. She had inherited her father's modest shop, a place where tallow and beeswax mingled with the perfume of lavender sprigs hung to dry above the workbench. By day, she dipped wicks and sold her candles to those who could afford even this small luxury. Lamplight for the darkening corridors of their villas. By night, she sat by her oil lamp, watching shadows gather in the corners as she whispered old stories to her daughter, Marcia, who curled beside her on a rough wool blanket. Lucilla had grown up when the streets were still swept each dawn by slaves who sang in languages from every corner of the empire. She remembered fountains that flowed clean and clear, patricians who walked the marble avenues with a confident tilt of the chin, and the laughter of children in the public baths. Now, the baths stood cold, weeds pushing through cracked mosaics, and the marble steps were more often used by beggars than by statesmen. Yet in her small shop, Lucilla held on to the old ways, polishing her brass scales, counting her coins carefully, teaching Marcia the value of honest trade. One evening, as twilight spilled soft and violet over the city, a customer came, his cloak threadbare, his eyes darting at the passing shadows. He asked for candles, but cheap ones, tallow, not beeswax. Lucilla wrapped them in linen scraps, noticing how his hands trembled when he reached for his purse. She did not speak of it. The hush of Rome taught its people to mind the quiet, to turn their gaze inward. After he left, Marcia asked, "Mama, why do so many people look afraid now?" Lucilla smoothed her daughter's hair back from her brow and answered softly, "Because when the roads are not safe and the soldiers are not paid, fear becomes our daily bread." She did not say that the taxes had risen again, that the streets at night belonged to bands of thieves and desperate men, that the Senate argued in endless circles while granaries lay empty. She did not speak of the rumors, barbarians crossing rivers, settlements burning beyond the walls. For Marcia, she painted a softer truth, that Rome, like an old man, needed sleep and care to wake strong once more. In the days that followed, Lucilla noticed more strangers in the district. Men with rough accents, wearing pieced-together armor that looked like it had been taken from a battlefield and stitched to fit. They lingered near the wine shops, watching passers-by with hungry eyes. Some called them mercenaries. Some whispered they were barbarians hired to guard the city's edges because Roman recruits had grown scarce. Whatever they were, they drank greedily and paid poorly. When they left, the alley behind Lucilla's shop stank of spilled wine and bitter arguments. One night, a commotion woke Lucilla from her shallow sleep. She rose, careful not to disturb Marcia, and peeked through the shutters. Torches bobbed in the darkness like fireflies. Voices, angry, slurred, rose and fell in harsh Latin and other tongues she did not know. She pressed her palm against the wooden shutter, feeling the warmth of the summer night seep into her skin, and wondered how long a city could stand when its watchmen were strangers who owed it no loyalty. The next morning, the baker next door found his door splintered, his bread gone. No one spoke to the magistrate, no one believed he would listen, for he too had grown cautious, avoiding the streets after dusk. Lucilla gathered Marcia's hand in her own and said, "Today we visit your aunt in the countryside." She wrapped the coins she could spare in a strip of cloth and hid them in her hair. She told her neighbor to watch the shop and left the shutters latched tight, hoping to find a pocket of calm beyond the city's crumbling walls. They walked at dawn, past the temples whose marble gods stared down with empty eyes, past fountains choked with dry reeds, past doorways where children slept curled like cats, hungry but quiet. Outside the gates, the air smelled sweeter, fields of wheat shimmering gold, olive groves nodding in the breeze. For a moment, Lucilla felt the weight in her chest lift. Here, the empire's sickness seemed distant, the soil still generous to those who tended it. At her sister's farm, Lucilla found more signs of change. Fewer hands to work the fields, neighbors who spoke of raids along the river, harvest wagons forced to travel under guard. Yet there was laughter too, soft and stubborn. In the evenings, as cicadas sang, Lucilla sat beneath the fig tree, Marcia dozing in her lap, and told stories of the Rome she once knew. A Rome of marble and law, of amphitheaters filled with cheers, of markets where spices perfumed the air, and poets wove words that outlived emperors. She wondered if her daughter would believe her, years from now, when only ruins remained to prove her tales true. But she spoke them anyway, each word a small defiance against the hush that threatened to swallow the city whole. And as the night deepened, Lucilla lifted her eyes to the endless stars and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might still be listening, that they would guard this fragile dream of Rome, if only a little while longer. In the gentle hush of the countryside, where the olive groves rustled softly under the caress of the summer breeze, Lucilla and Marcia found a fragile kind of peace. Days passed in a rhythm older than Rome itself, sunrise stirring the fields awake, dusk bringing the farm folk to gather by the hearth. Here the world seemed smaller, simpler, yet even this pocket of calm could not entirely seal them away from the distant rumble of a faltering empire. Lucilla's sister, Flavia, welcomed them with open arms and eyes that mirrored Lucilla's own worry. Flavia's farm, a modest sprawl of wheat, figs, and olives, had once fed 5 households. Now, with so few workers left, the land sighed beneath the burden of too much soil and too few hands. Many had left, drawn to cities for promises of work that vanished like mist at dawn, or conscripted to guard the crumbling frontiers. Yet the sisters did not speak of these things aloud. Instead, they found solace in shared tasks, mending nets, pressing olives, teaching Marcia to braid wheat stalks into little crowns. At twilight, when the farm grew still save for the distant cry of an owl, Lucilla would wander the rows of fig trees. She felt the bark under her palms, rough and warm, a tether to something older than the city's marble. Sometimes Flavia joined her, their silence threaded with memories. They spoke of their childhood, of games played in the shadows of the aqueducts, of festivals bright with torches and laughter, of their father's voice as he taught them the weight of a fair measure and an honest word. Yet even under the silver wash of moonlight, news found its way to them. A traveling peddler, his mule burdened with jars of honey and bolts of rough cloth, brought word of more villages abandoned near the frontier. He spoke in hushed tones of bands of raiders who slipped past watchtowers left unmanned, of legions recalled to the capital, but never paid in full. He sold them a tiny pouch of salt, and before leaving, pressed his palm to Lucilla's and whispered, "Keep your doors barred at night, mistress. The roads are not what they once were." When he was gone, Flavia locked the gates herself, sliding the old iron bolt into place. She glanced at Lucilla, who understood without words. Danger no longer belonged only to distant borders. It seeped into the farmlands, winding through orchards and wheat fields like a silent snake. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky flared gold and rose, Marcia asked her mother, "Will Rome come here, Mama? Will the city find us?" Lucilla brushed a smear of flour from Marcia's cheek and gathered her close. "Rome is already here, my little bird," she murmured. "It lives in our hands, in the bread we bake, in the lamp we light when darkness comes." She did not speak of the Senate's decrees, of the Emperor's new taxes, of the guards who might never arrive if the need arose. Instead, she spoke of courage that could bloom quietly, like lavender by the candlemaker's bench. At night, sleep came lightly. The sisters lay on straw pallets, ears tuned to the slightest creak of the gate or rustle of leaves. One such night, Lucilla rose before dawn. She stepped outside, feet bare on the cold earth, and found herself staring at the horizon where the first pale ribbons of light unfolded. There, standing beneath the old olive tree, she felt the weight of an empire, not as marble and law, but as flesh and breath, millions of lives strung together, fraying at the edges yet clinging on. Behind her, the farmhouse door opened with a soft sigh. Flavia stepped out, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. They stood side by side, two daughters of Rome who had never held a sword, who had never walked the Senate's halls, yet who now carried the burden of its slow decay in the soft lines of their hands. "Do you ever wonder," Flavia whispered, her voice barely brushing the dawn, "if it could have been different? If the city could have stayed strong?" Lucilla's answer was a long breath, white in the cold. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was always meant to change, like seasons turn. Maybe Rome is not its walls or its legions, but its people. And people are never still for long. Inside the house, Marcia stirred in her sleep, mumbling half-formed dreams. Lucilla turned back to the door, feeling the warmth of the hearth pull her forward. She knew they could not hide on this farm forever. Sooner or later, the tremors that cracked Rome's marble would reach even here, rattling shutters and shaking the roots of fig and olive alike. But for now, in this sliver of dawn, she allowed herself a heartbeat of quiet hope. Hope that somewhere, beyond the crumbling roads and wavering banners, the spirit of Rome yet lingered. In the calloused hands of farmers, in the patient weaving of mothers, in the soft questions of children who still believed their world could be made whole again. So Lucilla stepped inside, drew the bolt across the door, and gathered her daughter close as the first birdsong broke over the fields. Fragile as Rome, but alive all the same. As the season edged toward autumn, the fields around Flavia's farm turned the color of old gold. The wheat rippled under a cooling breeze, each stalk heavy with promise, yet tinged with the dread that lingered like a shadow behind every harvest. For Lucilla, the days became a gentle ritual, waking to the low murmur of farmhands, guiding Marcia through simple lessons in the shade of the olive grove, then tending to chores that needed more hands than there were to give. The sisters knew their borrowed peace would not hold forever. It was whispered among neighbors that a new levy had been declared, an order for more grain, more livestock, more taxes to feed Rome's hungry legions and its hungrier officials. Men came riding from the nearest town, cloaked in the empire's faded authority, bearing scrolls that crackled when opened and seals that looked more threatening than the dull blades at their sides. One such man, Publius by name, arrived at Flavia's gate just as the sun hovered high and indifferent over the land. His horse kicked up dust along the narrow path, scattering chickens and drawing curious eyes from children too young to remember when such visits meant anything but trouble. Publius dismounted stiffly, his sandals scuffing the dry earth. His face, weathered by years on the road, wore an expression more weary than cruel. Though his eyes held no warmth, Lucilla watched from the doorway as Flavia stepped forward, her apron still dusted with flour. Publius unrolled his decree, speaking in the flat tone of a man who had delivered too much bad news to too many who could do nothing but bow their heads and obey. The harvest must be weighed and a share sent to the town granary, 2 bushels for every 10. Failure to comply will invite fines or seizure. His voice faltered on the last word, as if he too disliked the sound of it. Flavia crossed her arms, her voice calm but iron strong. 2 for every 10 leaves, little enough for our own winter. Last season we lost a third to blight. Will the empire feed my children when the snow comes? Publius looked at her, perhaps seeing not a defiant farmer, but a reflection of 1,000 other weary souls whose taxes paid for the marble halls he had never set foot in. He sighed. "Mistress, I do not write these orders. I only bear them." He nodded toward the stables. "I will rest here tonight. At dawn the grain must be ready to weigh." Lucilla and Flavia exchanged no words. They needed none. After Publius vanished into the shade of the stable, Flavia leaned her head against the doorframe. "They bleed us in coin and now in seed," she whispered. "How many seasons before there is nothing left to take?" That night, after Marcia had been coaxed to sleep by Lucilla's soft hum of an old lullaby, the sisters sat by the dying hearth. The farm lay silent beyond the thick walls, but the hush felt heavier than any city noise. A pot of barley stew cooled untouched. Lucilla turned the wooden spoon in her hands, feeling its smooth grain beneath her fingertips. "When Father died," she said softly, "he told me that Rome was a river, wider than any one of us, carrying us all whether we chose to swim or sink. He said that if the river ran dry, it would not matter how well we swam." Flavia's eyes gleamed in the flickering light. "Do you believe him still?" Lucilla set the spoon down. "I think the river is sick. It leaks through cracks the emperors cannot mend. It feeds itself on the smallest streams until the streams run dry too." For a time they sat in silence, broken only by the quiet crackle of the hearth's last embers. Outside, an owl called once, its voice a hollow echo in the night. Then Flavia spoke, her voice low but resolute. "If Rome forgets us, then we must remember ourselves. The empire may take our grain, but we'll keep seeds for the spring. We'll keep enough to plant again." The next morning, Publius weighed the harvest with eyes that never met Flavia's. He took what the decree demanded, then rode away without a backward glance. His horse's hooves left prints in the dust that the sisters knew would vanish with the next good wind. After he was gone, Lucilla and Marcia carried baskets to the barn. Hidden beneath layers of straw, carefully wrapped in linen and sealed in clay pots, lay a portion of grain unclaimed by the empire's scrolls and seals. Lucilla ran her hand over the pots and felt a flicker of triumph, small but bright. This, she thought, is Rome too. A quiet rebellion stitched into the soil, a promise that what was taken in tribute could be given back by the earth, if only they were clever enough to trust its generosity. Days grew shorter. Leaves turned and fell in drifting rust and gold. Each dusk, Lucilla stood at the edge of the fields, watching the horizon for signs of trouble, figures that did not belong, smoke that should not rise. Yet each dusk also brought the song of crickets, the smell of bread baking, the warmth of Marcia's small hand in hers. And so, even as the empire's grasp reached deeper into their lives, Lucilla held fast to this small corner of hope, not carved in marble nor sung by poets in the Senate's echoing halls, but whispered in kitchens, tucked beneath straw, and planted like seeds beneath the fading sun. The first frost arrived one dawn without warning, laying its silvery fingers across Flavia's fields. Lucilla woke to the sound of the wind's new sharpness rattling the shutters, the crackle of ice along the eaves. She wrapped Marcia in a woolen cloak and stepped out into the crisp air, her breath rising in soft, fleeting clouds that drifted upward toward a paling sky. The harvest was over, but the work did not cease. Each day now was a race against winter's encroaching claim, bundling kindling, patching the stable roof, salting what meat could be spared, burying clay pots of grain deep enough that frost might forget them. In this season, the sisters' hands cracked and bled at the knuckles, but they spoke little of the ache. There was a silent understanding that only the prepared would see the spring with enough strength to begin again. One morning, as Lucilla split kindling near the woodshed, she heard hoofbeats along the farm's narrow lane. She paused, axe braced against the log, and waited. Around the bend came a pair of riders, men dressed not in the frayed cloaks of tax collectors, but in leather jerkins patched over with scraps of iron. Their horses snorted clouds into the cold, their eyes flicking warily at the farmhouse. Lucilla's breath caught. She had heard enough tales in the past weeks, neighbors speaking of roving bands of deserters, soldiers who had thrown away the empire's crest yet kept its weapons. Men who once swore fealty to Rome now swore only to their hunger. Flavia emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, her face an unmoving mask. The taller rider swung down, his boots crunching frostbitten grass. He raised a hand, though whether in greeting or warning was unclear. "Good day, mistress," he called, his voice rough as unshorn wool. "We seek shelter for a night. Food, if you can spare it. We'll pay, if you doubt our honesty." Lucilla noted how his hand rested near the dagger at his belt, even as he spoke. She glanced at Flavia, who met her eyes with a fleeting question. There was no safe choice. Turn them away, and they might take shelter by force. Welcome them, and pray their word was worth more than the wind. Flavia gave a slow nod. We are not rich in food nor coin, sir, but you may have a corner of the barn and a bowl of stew. The man inclined his head, his mouth curling in something that might once have been a smile. Fair enough, mistress. Fair enough. Through the day, the strangers lingered at the edge of the yard. One wandered toward the henhouse until Lucilla's sharp word turned him back. She kept Marcia close, giving the child small tasks in the kitchen, though Marcia sensed the shift in the air. How the sisters moved with quieter steps, how the barn door was barred with more care than usual. At dusk, the men took their stew by the hearth, their shadows flickering long against the walls. They spoke little, though one hummed a snatch of an old legionary's tune, the kind Lucilla's father used to whistle when Rome still seemed invincible. Between spoonfuls, the taller man, who named himself Gaius, spoke of roads choked with others like him, soldiers turned drifters when pay ran dry, and generals vanished into the whirl of civil squabbles. It's not our fault, he muttered, eyes low over his bowl. We bled for Rome, and now Rome's emptied its purse and left us to beg or steal. His companion gave a harsh laugh at that, though he quieted quickly under Lucilla's steady gaze. When the last scraps were eaten and the fire burned down to red coals, Flavia rose to show them to the barn. Gaius paused at the door, his breath misting in the cold. You have a good place here, mistress, he said, voice softer than before. Good land, good folk, keep it safe if you can. Lucilla wished she could believe there was safety left in the keeping. She only nodded and barred the door behind him. Long after Marcia's breathing evened out in sleep, Lucilla sat awake at the hearth. Flavia joined her, shoulders draped in an old shawl. They did not speak of what they both feared, that desperate men were no longer only rumors on the road, but guests at their table. That walls of wood and faith might not be enough when hunger wore a soldier's boots. Outside, frost thickened over the fields, each blade of grass a ghostly dagger glinting beneath the moon. Lucilla pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the soft thud of her own heart, a small, stubborn drum against the cold and the fear. In that quiet, she thought of Rome's marble arches, of candlelit villas, of warm baths and full amphitheaters. How strange, she mused, that an empire so vast could shrink to a single farmhouse in the dark, two sisters watching flames and listening for footsteps in the frost. At last she rose, added one last log to the fire, and tucked the blanket tighter around Marcia's sleeping form. When the embers hissed and glowed, Lucilla whispered a promise she scarcely believed herself, that come spring, seeds would still break the soil, children would still chase each other through fields of green, and perhaps, just perhaps, the hush that had fallen over Rome would lift, if only for a while. Winter came in earnest, sweeping down from the northern hills with a force that left the olive groves bare and the wheat stubble buried beneath thin crusts of snow. In Flavia's farmhouse, warmth became the currency by which each night was endured, a hearth fed sparingly with precious logs, wool blankets patched and repatched, bodies drawn close to share the small gift of breath. The two soldiers lingered longer than either sister had wished. Gaius, with his rough courtesy, helped mend the stable roof when a storm tore loose the old tiles. His companion Severus proved less obliging, prone to slipping away toward the henhouse when he thought no one was watching, to drinking from the clay jug of cider as if it were his own. Yet always he returned before dusk, the weight of the cold driving even the boldest man back to the fragile shelter of the hearth. At first, the sisters told themselves it was only a few nights more. These men were wanderers. They would move on when they grew restless. But the snow fell thicker each dawn, burying the roads and pressing silence against the farmhouse walls like a great white hand. When Gaius spoke, it was no longer of leaving, but of staying, until the thaw, until the roads opened again, until the empire remembered its forgotten sons. One evening, Lucilla found herself seated across from Gaius by the hearth. Marcia dozed nearby, curled like a small cat beneath a patchwork quilt. Flavia sat in the far corner, mending a tear in her only winter cloak, her needle glinting in the wavering firelight. "Did you ever stand in the Forum?" Gaius asked suddenly, his voice low but clear. "When it was full, when marble gleamed and the banners snapped above the crowd?" Lucilla studied his face. In the soft glow of the hearth, he looked younger, almost as if the hard lines of his jaw and the gray flecks in his beard were only soot and shadow. "I did," she said. "When I was a girl, my father would take me to watch the magistrates speak. He said the marble steps were built to carry words so they would outlast us." Gaius laughed, but the sound cracked in his throat. And now words rot like grain left too long in the sack. He turned his palm up, staring at the old scar that ran from thumb to wrist, a soldier's mark, or perhaps something older still. "I bled for Rome on the Rhine, then the Danube, fought the tribes, men with hair like fire and axes that split the winter fog. We held the line for years, and when they told us we'd march home, they forgot to say there'd be no coin waiting, no land, no feast, just emptiness." Lucilla wanted to hate him then, this man who ate their bread, who might yet bring trouble to their door. But she saw in him something that softened her anger, the same bone-deep exhaustion she saw in Flavia's eyes when the day's work stole all her strength. Rome had promised too much to too many, and now its promises rang hollow as the wind. "Why here?" she asked. "Why stay in this small place when you could ride on? South, maybe, where the roads might open sooner." Gaius lowered his hand and looked toward Marcia, her small form rising and falling with sleep. "Because here, the hearth is warm. Here I am not a ghost yet. On the road there is only cold and the edge of a blade in the dark." Severus, leaning against the far wall, snorted at this talk. "Spare her your poet's tongue, Gaius. A warm fire doesn't make us kin. We'll take what we need when we need it." Flavia's needle paused mid-stitch. The room tightened around that single spoken threat, though no one moved to answer it. Instead, Lucilla met Severus's gaze with her own, calm, steady, unwavering. "Take what you will," she said softly, "but know this, we are women who have buried more than we have harvested. We do not fear empty barns, only empty graves." The threat passed like a shiver, no more than words, yet enough to fold the silence back over the room. Severus turned away, muttering into the shadows. Gaius shifted closer to the hearth, his eyes distant, lost in flames that danced and crackled as if mocking all they warmed. That night, sleep came to Lucilla only in scraps. She lay with Marcia pressed to her side, the child's breath soft against her collarbone. Beyond the shutter, the wind prowled through the frozen trees, rattling loose branches, testing the strength of the thatch above. She wondered how many other families huddled in similar dark corners that winter. Families who once lived in houses of stone and mosaic now crouched behind splintered doors and whispered of taxes, soldiers, and the next sunrise. Toward dawn, Lucilla rose and went to the window. The snow outside glowed faintly under a wan moon, all tracks and footprints erased by the night's relentless drift. Somewhere beneath that white silence lay the promise of seed and soil, waiting for warmth that might never come. In that hush, she thought again of her father's words. Rome as a river, carrying all things whether they would swim or sink. Yet tonight, it felt less like a river and more like a tide gone out, leaving broken hulls and lost sailors to wander its barren shoals. And still, in the hush, she dared to believe that if she could just keep this small hearth burning, this single flame alive, then perhaps, when the thaw came at last, she and Marcia would find a way to follow the river's course back to something like hope. The new year crept in beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, and with it came the bitterest cold yet. Frost laced every beam of the farmhouse, crawling in through the smallest cracks, icing the buckets in the stable and turning each breath into drifting ghosts. Inside, life contracted into the single room where the hearth glowed, dim but determined, a frail shield against the gnawing wind. Lucilla rose earlier than the rest each morning, her feet slipping into boots stiff with cold. She would stir the embers to life, coaxing reluctant flames from yesterday's ashes, while Marcia still dreamed under patched wool. Some mornings she heard Gaius too, his steps soft in the dark as he moved about the barn, feeding the horses, checking the old fencing for cracks that might tempt wolves closer. They had not spoken of Severus's harsh words since that night by the hearth, but his presence hovered like smoke, acrid and persistent. He carved strips of salted meat without asking, dipped his cup deep into the cider, and when he walked the yard, his hand never strayed far from the dagger at his side. Yet he did not leave, nor did Gaius. They seemed bound to the farm by the same cold that shackled the land itself, trapped as much as the sisters were by the walls they huddled within. On a morning when the frost had thickened to glass upon the windows, Lucilla found Marcia peering through a gap in the shutter. The child's breath fogged the wood as she pressed her small face closer. "What do you see?" Lucilla asked, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Tracks," Marcia whispered. "In the snow. A fox, maybe? Or something bigger." Lucilla's eyes followed where Marcia pointed. There, leading away from the barn, a trail of prints crossed the whitened yard toward the tree line. She knew at once they were not fox tracks. They were boot prints, one pair lighter, the stride crooked, as if the wearer had staggered through the snow, half drunk or half lost. Severus. She felt it in her bones. When Gaius entered, stamping snow from his boots, Lucilla turned to him. She pointed toward the tracks, but he only lowered his gaze, shame flickering in the lines around his eyes. "He took cider from the stores," Gaius said softly. "I told him to leave it. He wouldn't listen." Flavia, who had come to stand behind them unnoticed, crossed her arms. "If he draws trouble back to us, there will be no warmth deep enough to hide us." They did not go after Severus. To hunt him down in the woods would be folly. Better, Lucilla thought grimly, to let the forest's cold do what they could not. So they turned back to their tasks, the tracks slowly filling with drifting flakes, as if the land itself wished to forget. In the days that followed, the farmhouse shrank further still. Gaius kept more to the barn, tending the animals with a silent diligence that Lucilla found both comforting and troubling. He no longer spoke of the road or of Rome's broken promises. Instead, he mended the fence, split kindling, mumbled soft apologies to the old goat that butted him when he tried to patch its pen. One dusk, Lucilla found him leaning against the stable door, his breath a mist in the pale twilight. "You fear me now," he said without turning to her. It was not a question. She stepped closer, her hands buried deep in her cloak. "I fear many things," she answered, "but not you. Not yet." He laughed once, a rough sound that caught in the cold. "You should. Men like me were made by Rome's hunger, fed into its legions, spat out into the snow. When the empire forgets us, we forget ourselves." Lucilla studied him. This man, who might once have carried an eagle standard into battle, now patched in rags and regret. "Then remember yourself here," she said. "We have so little left. But if you guard this place, you may yet guard something of yourself too." He met her eyes at last. There was a flicker there, something softer than the hard soldier's stare, a memory perhaps of the boy he once was, before the Rhine, before the Danube, before the long hunger of the frontiers. Inside, Marcia's laughter floated from the hearth, where Flavia taught her to twist scraps of wool into thread. The sound lifted into the rafters, fragile but clear, a note of warmth in a world grown cold. That night, Lucilla lay beside her daughter, listening to the wind worrying the shutters. She wondered if Severus had found shelter, or if the forest's teeth had claimed him already. She wondered if Gaius's quiet penance might truly hold. But most of all, she wondered what pieces of Rome might still live in the dark, hidden in barns, whispered in lullabies, wrapped tight in a mother's arms. Beyond the walls, the snow fell deeper. Yet within the farmhouse, a single ember glowed. Small, defiant, waiting for the thaw. Winter lingered like a stubborn guest, unwelcome yet immovable. The days crept by, each much like the one before. Gray dawn, the slow tending of fires, the careful rationing of grain and salted meat, the watchful silence broken only by the hiss of wind against the shutters. Yet within that sameness, Lucilla felt the fragile threads that bound them all tighten and shift in ways she could not name. When the sun appeared, pale and distant, it offered no warmth, only a brief promise that somewhere, far from their frozen patch of earth, spring still waited its turn. On such a day, Lucilla took Marcia out into the yard for the first time in many weeks. Bundled in 2 cloaks, the child giggled when her boots sank deep into drifts of snow, her cheeks blooming pink against the brittle air. "Stay where I can see you," Lucilla called gently, her voice carried off by the wind that rustled the dry branches overhead. Marcia chased her own footprints in widening circles, weaving around the old olive tree that stood, bare-limbed and stoic beside the barn. Lucilla watched her, letting herself drift for a moment into memories of other winters, when Rome's streets bustled even in the cold, when sweet nuts roasted over braziers at every corner, when she and her father haggled for candles and spices, laughing at the bright clangor of a city that seemed unbreakable. A sound snapped her back. Gaius emerged from the barn, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his breath a fog as he moved toward the fence. He paused when he saw Lucilla watching him. "I found where the fox got in," he said, nodding toward the pen where two hens huddled uneasily. "I'll mend it before dusk." She nodded. Words seemed too thin for what hovered between them now. A strange pact, not quite trust, but something near enough to keep the fear at bay. They spoke in tasks instead: rope, fence, feed, wood. A language older than Rome's marble decrees. Marcia ran up then, her arms filled with clumps of snow that fell apart in her mittens. "Mama, look! It sparkles like the wax you used to make candles." Lucilla bent down, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "It does, little bird, but snow melts faster than any candle flame." Marcia's eyes darted to Gaius, who stood watching them with a quiet that seemed almost shy. "Did you fight where there was snow?" she asked him suddenly. Children's questions, Lucilla knew, fell where they would, unbothered by the weight they sometimes carried. Gaius crouched, so his face was level with Marcia's. "I did," he said softly. "Snow deeper than you are tall, cold that bit your bones and wouldn't let go." "Were you scared?" Marcia asked, her mittened hand tugging at his sleeve. He hesitated, then gave her a small crooked smile. "Yes, but we pretended we weren't." Lucilla felt a stirring in her chest then, an ache for this man who had traded his youth for a promise Rome could not keep. And for her daughter, too, who listened to a soldier's confession as if it were a bedtime tale, not a wound that never quite closed. The sun dipped lower, the frail light slipping behind the leafless trees. Lucilla took Marcia's hand and led her back toward the house. Behind them, Gaius turned to his task, driving stakes into the frozen ground with a steady rhythm that echoed faintly across the snow. Inside, Flavia was bent over the hearth, stirring a thin stew of lentils and dried herbs. She looked up as Lucilla entered, her eyes flicking to Marcia's flushed cheeks, then to Lucilla's face. "Still no sign of him?" Flavia asked. She did not say his name. Severus was a shadow neither sister wished to conjure outright. Lucilla shook her head. "No, and if the snow holds, the woods will keep him." They said no more of it. Instead, they sat together at the table when the sun finally gave up its last light, sharing bowls of stew that tasted of wood smoke and resolve. Marcia drifted off beside the hearth, her head resting in Lucilla's lap, while Flavia worked a spindle in her quiet, methodical way. Gaius entered just before the last embers died, his boots crusted with frost. He shed his cloak, settled near the fire, and spoke only to say, "The fence will hold tonight." Lucilla nodded, her hand resting on Marcia's hair, feeling the warmth of her child's small body as a talisman against the deepening cold. She looked at Gaius, at Flavia, at the small circle they made in that circle of flickering light. Rome felt distant. No senators' voices, no marble arches, no coins pressed into the hands of distant officials. Only this, 4 souls gathered against winter's hush. Outside, snow continued its silent work, burying old tracks, erasing signs of what had been. But inside, a heartbeat of warmth endured, frail as a candle flame, yes, yet stubborn, clinging to the hope that soon, somewhere beyond the white fields and broken roads, the earth would stir again and life would rise from the silence. The days began to lengthen, though the sun's warmth was still only a rumor that drifted among bare branches and the brittle grass hidden beneath the snow. Each dawn, Lucilla listened for signs of thaw, a drip from the eaves, the crack of ice loosening from the stable roof. But winter clung stubbornly to the land, as if unwilling to yield its hold all at once. In the farmhouse, life folded in upon itself. The 4 of them moved through narrow routines, Flavia kneading what little flour remained into rough loaves, Lucilla patching blankets and tending to Marcia's lessons, Gaius splitting wood with a silence that spoke more than any legion's trumpet. When the wind died, they could almost pretend the world beyond the fences was asleep rather than unraveling. One afternoon, as pale light spilled across the yard, Lucilla took Marcia to gather what dry twigs could be found along the fence line. She watched her daughter wander ahead, small hands brushing against the wooden posts, her breath clouding the air like a soft promise. "Stay where I can see you," Lucilla called, though she knew the child would not stray far. Marcia turned, her cheeks flushed, and offered her mother a smile so bright it seemed to carve a path through the gray hush. It was then Lucilla saw Gaius at the edge of the orchard, kneeling by a shallow drift where the snow lay churned and disturbed. He rose as she approached, and though his shoulders were broad and his hands strong enough to wield any blade, in that moment he looked almost fragile, as if the wind might scatter him like chaff. "What is it?" Lucilla asked, voice low to keep Marcia from hearing. He shifted aside, revealing a shape half buried beneath the snow, ragged cloth, a boot caked with ice, and a pale hand curled inward as if still clutching warmth that had long fled. Severus. Lucilla closed her eyes, but only for a moment. When she opened them, the world was sharper, clearer. Cold wind on her skin, the soft crunch of Marcia's steps behind her, Gaius's quiet breath beside her. "He found his winter," Gaius said, not quite an apology, not quite a prayer. Lucilla nodded. She felt no triumph, no grief either. Severus had made his choice long before the snow had claimed him, when he had looked at the hearth and seen only something to take, never something to keep warm. Rome's broken soldiers had taught her that some wounds the Empire gave were too deep for any hearth to mend. "Help me," she said, her voice steady. Together they lifted what remained of Severus, carrying him past the orchard and into the copse where the ground, though frozen, might yield to careful hands. Gaius dug while Lucilla stood watch, her eyes tracing the bare branches overhead, the drift of a lone raven that circled once, then vanished into the distant trees. When it was done, they did not speak any blessing. There were no priests here, no marble tombs, no carved words to mark the passing of one more soul lost to the Empire's hush. Only the wind carried Severus onward, and perhaps that was enough. By dusk, the snow fell again, fine flakes that settled like ashes over the orchard. Lucilla returned to the farmhouse with Gaius walking beside her, close enough that their shoulders brushed when the path narrowed. Inside, Flavia said nothing when she saw them. She only stirred the stew and placed a bowl before each of them, her fingers lingering on Lucilla's hand for a heartbeat longer than needed. Marcia, who knew nothing of graves or broken men, climbed into Lucilla's lap with a whisper of questions about spring. When the trees would bloom, when the bees would return, when they could go back to the city and find the candle shop waiting as it always had. Lucilla pressed her lips to Marcia's temple, closing her eyes to the weight of that hope. She wanted to promise her daughter that such things could still be true, that the shop's shutters would lift and the marble streets would shine once more beneath the sun. But promises were heavy now, and the hush of Rome had taught her to spend them carefully. Instead, she said, "One day, little bird, one day, the bees will come. And when they do, we will gather their gold and light every dark corner." Later that night, long after Marcia's breath fell into sleep's gentle rhythm, Lucilla sat by the hearth, her needle tracing repairs through worn linen. Gaius sat nearby, shaping a rough piece of wood into something like a toy horse, his knife whispering over the grain. Flavia hummed an old tune, her voice drifting through the room like a lullaby spun from memory and thin hope. Outside, the wind howled across the orchard, sweeping snow over the small, unmarked mound among the trees. But within the farmhouse walls, the flame flickered steady and stubborn, one small ember against the hush that threatened to smother all of Rome. And though Lucilla knew the thaw would not come quickly, she felt, in that quiet moment, that perhaps it would come all the same. The first true sign of the thaw arrived not in warmth, but in water, a quiet, patient dripping that broke winter's hush like a voice too long held silent. One morning, before dawn had fully spread its pale light across the orchard, Lucilla woke to that sound. At first, she thought it a trick of sleep, a dream lingering in the space between night and waking. But when she rose from the pallet where Marcia still slept, breathing softly against her side, she heard it clearly, a steady patter, soft yet certain, tracing its rhythm down the farmhouse wall. She drew back the shutter and felt a brush of cold air, not as sharp as the bitterest nights had been, but carrying with it a scent of soil and dampness. On the sill, beads of meltwater gathered and fell one by one, darkening the frozen earth below. The icicles that had hung from the eaves like brittle fangs now wept their own surrender, thin streams that carved tiny paths through the snowdrifts banked against the stones. When Flavia stirred awake, Lucilla pointed to the window without a word. Flavia came to stand beside her, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes tracing the dripping water as if reading a promise written in a language older than marble or decree. "Do you think the worst is done?" Flavia asked, her voice hardly more than breath. Lucilla didn't answer at first. She let her palm rest against the sill, feeling the faint tremor of water moving where ice had ruled. "Not yet," she said at last. "But the earth remembers how to wake. So must we." By the time Gaius came in from the barn, the sun had risen fully into a pale sky scrubbed clean of clouds. He set down a bucket that sloshed with water from the stream behind the orchard, the first he'd managed to draw since the frost had locked it beneath a crust of ice weeks ago. "The brook's moving again," he said, his grin hidden in the lines of his wind-chapped face. "Slow as a whisper, but enough." Flavia crossed to the hearth, where the last coals of the night's fire smoldered. She set her hands on the edge of the mantel, eyes closing for a heartbeat longer than a blink. "Then we begin again," she murmured. That day, they worked with a new rhythm, no quicker, perhaps, but less burdened by the weight of waiting. Gaius broke the ice from the troughs, coaxed the old pump at the well into coughing up water sweet and clear. Lucilla flung open the shutters wide, so sunlight spilled across the floor in pale golden pools, stirring dust motes that danced like tiny embers drifting upward. Marcia followed her mother through the yard, her feet leaving prints in the softening crust of snow. She paused by the fence where the chickens clucked and pecked at patches of earth newly bared to the sun's frail warmth. Lucilla heard her daughter laugh, a sound so sudden, so bright against the hush that had hung heavy for too long that she stopped her work just to watch her. "Mama," Marcia called, lifting her mittened hand. "It's dripping on me, like when we washed in the baths." Lucilla felt a tug in her chest at the memory. Warm baths, marble floors slick with scented oils, laughter echoing under painted ceilings, luxuries that seemed as distant now as the first stones laid upon the Palatine Hill. Yet here, in this rough yard, the water still found its way back, singing its promise into the soil. Later, when the sun began to slip behind the orchard's bare branches, Lucilla found Gaius near the barn, mending the last break in the fence. His hands were raw from the cold, yet steady. When he saw her, he straightened, the coil of rope slung over his shoulder like a legionary's kit bag. "You'll leave when the road's open," she said, her voice gentle, carrying neither blame nor plea, only the truth they both knew too well. He didn't look away, but his mouth worked as if shaping words too stubborn to rise. "I should," he said after a moment. "A man like me, I've no farm to tend. No reason to weigh down honest folk with an old soldier's shadow." Lucilla stepped closer, the thawing earth soft beneath her boots. "Yet you stayed through the frost," she said, "when you could have gone." Gaius's eyes flickered toward the orchard, the fence, the fragile warmth drifting from the open kitchen door. "You gave me a roof," he said simply, "a reason to lift my hands to something other than a blade." They stood there for a while in the falling dusk, listening to the water drip from the branches, the quiet snort of the old goat in its pen, Marcia's voice drifting through the open door, soft, sweet, stubbornly alive. When they finally stepped inside, the small circle of warmth felt different somehow, wider, not in walls or wealth, but in the quiet strength of souls determined to outlast the hush. Flavia stirred a pot of thin stew over the fire. Marcia curled at her feet with the wooden horse Gaius had carved. The child made it gallop across the hearthstones, whispering to it, as though it might truly carry her away when spring's first true bloom opened. That night, after the last log burned low and the farmhouse walls sighed under the melting snow, Lucilla lay with Marcia nestled close and listened to the soft tap of water on the sill. The hush of winter had not gone. It never truly left. But within its patient silence, a new sound was weaving itself, one drop, then another, then a stream of them tracing hope into the bones of a land that refused to sleep forever. And in that hush, Lucilla let her eyes close, dreaming not of marble arches or senate steps, but of seed and soil, of roots drinking deep, of the soft green push that would come soon enough. Quiet, yes, but strong enough to break stone if given time. In the stillness of a world long turned to dust, our thoughts drift once more to the lands of the once mighty Rome, whose broken marble bones now sleep beneath ivy and moss. As the hush of evening deepens, let us turn our gaze to the shadows cast by the centuries and linger upon the silent unraveling of that imperial dream. The sun had long set upon the empire's greatest days, yet its twilight stretched on for centuries, a slow, reluctant surrender to time's relentless hand. In these waning years, we find ourselves walking down the Via Appia, that ancient road which once carried legions, merchants, and nobles alike. Now it is littered with fragments of old stones, weeds pushing stubbornly between the cracks. Along this road, trade caravans once bustled with silks from the east, spices from far Arabia, and glittering treasures from the African shores. But as the empire's borders shrank, so too did its veins of commerce. Pirates prowled the seas, bandits haunted the highways, and what once was safe passage grew treacherous and uncertain. Merchants who once paid tribute in gold and goods began to weigh risk heavier than profit. The empire's purse, once fattened by taxes levied across 3 continents, thinned into a meager trickle. The minting of coins, once a proud mark of Rome's wealth, became a desperate exercise in alchemy, mixing baser metals, debasing silver with tin and lead, each denarius worth less than the promise it carried. Markets grew quiet. The grand fora of Rome echoed with the footsteps of beggars, where senators once debated. In these troubled times, men of means withdrew behind high villa walls, building their own fortresses against the growing uncertainty. Great estates, once farms feeding the legions in the cities, became self-sufficient fiefdoms where peasants labored under stern landlords who promised protection from marauders. Thus was born, piece by piece, the early shadow of feudalism, each estate a tiny kingdom unto itself, loyal more to the lord behind its gates than to the far-off emperor in Ravenna or Byzantium. Yet even as the economy faltered, the people found ways to endure. In the small villages that dotted the countryside, craftsmen and farmers clung to old traditions. Potters still turned their wheels, smiths still hammered iron, bakers still coaxed warmth from stone ovens. But without the vast trade networks to ferry goods across the empire, their wares rarely traveled beyond the next village or town. The spirit of enterprise shrank into pockets of local survival, a dim glow where once there had been roaring flames of ambition. The great cities, once hubs of learning, trade, and culture, felt the slow seep of abandonment. Families who could afford it drifted outward, seeking the safety of rural lands where harvests, though meager, seemed more reliable than the hollow promises of urban granaries. Baths fell into disrepair, aqueducts crumbled stone by stone, and fountains that once sang the praises of Roman engineering dried to silence. Rats and stray dogs roamed where once toga-clad citizens discussed philosophy beneath colonnades. And yet in that ruin, there remained a haunting beauty. Ivy climbing marble, rain pooling in broken cisterns, the moonlight glinting off cracked mosaics. Meanwhile, emperors and generals quarreled endlessly over what little remained. They squeezed their people for taxes they could not pay, conscripted men who could no longer march, and built walls they could no longer defend. Gold meant for soldiers' wages lined the pockets of corrupt officials, while the soldiers themselves, Gauls, Goths, Franks, sometimes fought not for Rome, but for the highest bidder. Mercenary armies, loyal only to their own hunger, marched beneath Roman banners that fluttered like ghosts of the past. Still, beyond the cities and crumbling fortresses, the forests of Europe stretched vast and untamed. In these wilds, tribes gathered strength. Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, watching with patient eyes as the once unassailable giant began to wobble on legs made of dust and old dreams. They had tasted Roman wealth and Roman cruelty alike, and now they waited for the moment to strike again, to pluck ripe fruit from a dying tree. Yet the heart of Rome's fall was not found in one battle or one sacking, but in 1,000 tiny fractures that widened with each passing season. A drought that ruined a harvest here, a plague that emptied a village there, a governor who turned traitor, a legion that mutinied. Each small betrayal, each neglected aqueduct, each squandered coin chipped away at the empire's soul until what remained was more memory than power. And in this twilight, the people turned inward. They found new faith in churches rising from the bones of old temples. In cold, echoing basilicas, priests spoke of salvation and eternity, offering hope when the state offered none. The bishop's crook often carried more weight than the emperor's scepter, for what legion could promise paradise beyond the grave? As the Roman gods faded, replaced by the single cross, so too did the old ways of power and order wither into myth. So it was that the streets of Rome itself, once swept daily by slaves and civic pride, grew choked with weeds and the footprints of the desperate. Once the Colosseum had thundered with the roars of tens of thousands, watching gladiators clash in blood and sand. Now beggars made hearths beneath its arches, warming their hands where lions had once stalked. Marble statues were toppled and fed into lime kilns, their cold beauty sacrificed for mortar to patch a crumbling wall. And yet in that ruin, something new began to grow. For in the fall of great things, seeds often scatter wide. The knowledge of Rome did not vanish. It hid in monasteries and the careful script of monks who by candlelight copied old books line by line. The Roman roads, though broken, still guided travelers and pilgrims through wild lands. Latin, fractured by local tongues, grew into new languages, Italian, French, Spanish, carrying echoes of empire in every syllable. So we stand at this quiet crossroad of history, where coin lost its gleam, trade lost its vigor, and the mighty heart of Rome beats slower with each passing dusk. The markets are hushed, the great roads grow empty, and yet in the silence there is a promise that from these ashes new stories will rise. Kingdoms yet unformed, songs yet unsung, a world waiting patiently beyond the ruin's edge. As we leave the deserted road behind tonight, let us wonder what ember yet flickers in that ancient dust, and listen for the whispers of traders, soldiers, peasants, and kings, whose footsteps still echo faintly in the corridors of time, carrying us gently toward the next chapter of this endless, crumbling dream. Night settles softly over the battered lands once ruled by the Caesars, and in this darkness, we drift further into the hidden corridors of Rome's unraveling. Let us slip now into the hushed chambers of power, where the final flickers of imperial authority guttered like candles in a draughty hall. For if the roads fell to ruin and the markets to silence, it was within the marble palaces and echoing senate chambers that the last breath of the empire was drawn. It was not only the savage press of foreign tribes, nor the draining of coffers that hollowed Rome's core, but the slow rot of its own leadership. Men whose ambitions burned brighter than their loyalty, whose whispers of treason coiled through corridors more cunningly than any sword thrust could. For generations, Rome had suffered the poison of intrigue. Emperors raised up by legions, only to be slain by those same hands when the promise of richer spoils glimmered on the horizon. Consider the emperors of these late days, some born into noble bloodlines that once commanded respect, others mere soldiers who clawed their way to the purple cloak through cunning and steel. Each wore the diadem with unease, for they knew it sat not upon their brow, but upon the blade's edge. A general in the provinces might rise against them before winter's end, or a scheming courtier might slip poison into a goblet meant to toast the empire's glory. Within the crumbling palaces of Ravenna, or the old halls of Rome, the Senate itself, once the proud heart of Republican virtue, had become a shadow play of honor. Many senators clung to ancient titles that carried little real weight, their debates hollow echoes of past grandeur. Bribes changed more laws than votes did. Loyalty was a mask worn lightly, discarded when the winds of fortune shifted. The old patrician families, whose ancestors had marched behind triumphal chariots and governed vast provinces, now retreated behind garden walls, brooding over dwindling estates and family legacies that mattered little to hungry soldiers at their gates. Yet even amid this decay, there were moments when hope flared bright enough to dazzle the weary populace. A strong emperor would rise, a commander who inspired fear in enemies and devotion in legions. For a time, he would rally the people, drive back invaders, and mend the empire's fractured bones. But always, the flame flickered out. One man could not hold back the tide forever, and when he fell, by sword or poison or betrayal, his victories crumbled like dry parchment in the rain. It was not only emperors and generals who played this perilous game, but queens and empresses too, fierce women who learned to wield power with subtler weapons. In velvet-draped chambers, they bargained and conspired, forging alliances through marriage and bloodline, weaving fragile webs of influence that might break with the next assassin's blade. Stories tell of wives who plotted the downfall of husbands, mothers who betrayed sons, daughters wed to barbarian kings in desperate bids to buy peace. Their whispered intrigues drifted through marble halls, as deadly as any legion's march. Outside these palaces of ambition, the common people watched with weary eyes. They knew that when great men quarreled, it was their fields that burned, their sons who bled to settle rival claims. A tax to fund an emperor's coronation, a levy for the next doomed campaign. Always the cost fell upon shoulders already bent from labor and hunger. And so, trust frayed like an old cloak worn through at the seams. Where once Rome's people saw the emperor as the embodiment of their greatness, now he was too often a distant figure, glimpsed only in the graven face stamped on a debased coin. While power splintered within, the threats beyond Rome's walls grew bolder still. Ambassadors bearing tribute from far kingdoms came less often, replaced instead by warbands bearing iron and fire. The Gothic kings, once cowed by Roman might, now negotiated as equals or conquerors. Treaties were signed not from strength but from fear, the empire bartering gold it did not have for the promise of temporary peace. And in these uneasy truces, Rome's own leaders sometimes invited in the wolf, hiring barbarian mercenaries to fight other barbarians, until one day, the wolf no longer left when the fighting was done. Even religion, once a unifying force beneath the pagan pantheon and then under the Christian cross, became another battleground for power's corrosion. Bishops vied for influence, preaching rival doctrines that split communities and fueled bitter disputes. Councils convened to settle matters of the soul often tangled themselves in matters of the state instead, excommunicating rivals, blessing rebels, crowning new emperors when old ones fell. The divine and the temporal merged into a single tangle of fragile alliances and bitter schisms. And so it was that Rome's greatness bled out from within, less a single blow than a slow exsanguination through 1,000 cuts. The people, once inspired by the ideals of the Republic, then awed by the might of the empire, now saw power not as a sacred trust, but as a game for men with sharp knives and sharper tongues. Trust died. Loyalty thinned. What remained was a weary resignation, a hope only to survive the next famine, the next levy, the next invasion. Yet even in this deepening dusk, there flickered the stubborn light of human spirit. Among the palace guards, one might find a loyal soldier who still dreamed of Rome's return to glory. Among the senators, an old man who still recited Cicero's words beneath his breath, clinging to the ghost of virtue. Among the people, a mother who whispered tales of Aeneas and Romulus to her children, planting seeds of identity that would endure long after marble had crumbled and banners had rotted into soil. And so tonight we stand, quietly observing these corridors of intrigue and ambition, hearing the faint echoes of conspiracies hatched by lamplight, betrayals traded for coins and promises. Here, amid the silk hangings and stone colonnades, the mighty dream of Rome unraveled itself from the inside out. A house whose beams gave way not to siege or storm alone, but to the rot that festered where trust should have been. As the night deepens and the last torch gutters low in the emperor's hall, let us slip away, leaving these whispering shadows behind for now. There is more yet to see, beyond these palaces, beyond these fragile crowns. More stories carried by the wind across fields and forests where Rome's legacy wandered, seeking new soil in which to root and blossom again. Beyond the marble halls and scheming corridors, where emperors and senators played at power like gamblers tossing dice, the true breath of Rome drifted quietly through the farthest edges of its once mighty realm. Here, on the ragged frontiers where stone fortresses clung to windswept hills, we find the men who bore the empire's name upon their battered shields, soldiers who, for centuries, had been Rome's living wall against the restless dark beyond. In these final years, the legions were no longer the disciplined machine that once shattered Hannibal's hopes and brought distant kings to their knees. The old legionnaires, citizens molded by strict training and iron loyalty, had given way to ragged ranks of mercenaries and foreign recruits, Goths, Huns, Franks, even Vandals, fighting not for Roman glory, but for coin, land, or the thin promise of citizenship for their children. They wore the eagle upon their standards, but their hearts lay elsewhere. Walk now with me along the crumbling ramparts of a lonely frontier fort, perhaps along the Rhine, where the cold winds sigh through forests that have never bowed fully to Roman law. Here, the walls stand pitted and cracked, stones pried loose by time and neglect. The garrison, once hundreds strong, is now a scattered handful. They light fires against the chill, sharing tales of better days as they clutch spears whose iron tips have grown dull. Their armor is patched with mismatched scraps. Their boots wear through faster than the Empire can replace them. Yet still, they stand their watch. When word comes of raiders moving through the dark woods, they gather at the gates, Gaul and Goth shoulder to shoulder, bound not by patriotism but by necessity. Some dream, perhaps, that their service will win them a plot of land, a place to settle when the fighting is done. Others hope only to survive the next skirmish, to send a few battered coins home to families who wait behind village palisades. Beyond these watchfires, the tribes gather like storm clouds. The Franks push southward, the Alemanni probe the weakened border, the Saxons slip their ships up lonely rivers to raid quiet farms. Among these tribes are chieftains who know the Empire's weakness better than any Roman senator. They know which forts stand empty, which watchtowers lie abandoned, where the bribes can be paid to open a gate in the dead of night. They do not always come with sword drawn. Sometimes they come with wagons and families, seeking not plunder but farmland, pasture, safety from harsher enemies further east. So the frontiers blur. Roman and barbarian trade goods marry, share stories by firelight. A Roman commander might look upon a Gothic warlord not as an invader, but as a bargaining partner, another piece on the chessboard to play against rival generals. Treaties are signed on sheepskin, promising loyalty in exchange for land and the right to settle inside the borders that once defined the Empire's pride. But treaties can be broken as easily as bread, and when hunger or betrayal come calling, the new allies turn as readily as wolves on an injured stag. In the villages strung along these liminal lands, the people live by the mercy of both Rome and the tribes beyond. They pay taxes to distant governors who seldom send aid. They give tribute to local chieftains who promise protection when the legions are too few. They till their fields during the brief, tender months of peace, and when rumors of war grow close, they bury grain in hidden pits and watch the horizon for smoke. Children grow up learning words in Latin and Gothic alike, never certain which tongue will save their lives. Yet even here, among these weary farmers and restless tribes, Rome's mark lingers stubbornly. A stone bridge over a river, still standing after centuries, carries carts laden with grain and salt. A crumbling milestone by the roadside bears the faint chisel marks of an emperor's name long forgotten. A ruined villa, its frescoes fading beneath moss, becomes a meeting place where traders and elders argue over the price of cattle and barley. In these small ways, the Empire endures, not in banners or legions, but in stone and habit and the memories passed from father to son. But there are places, too, where that endurance falters altogether. Some forts are abandoned to the wild, their walls swallowed by ivy and brambles. Wolves prowl the old parade grounds. Owls nest in the rafters of the watchtowers. Travelers speak of ghostly patrols, phantom legions that march at dusk along overgrown roads, echoes of an order that once bound the world in law and stone. Whether these stories are true matters little. They are reminders that where Rome withdraws, the wild creeps back in. In the distance, the cities that once anchored the frontier fade into uneasy quiet. Trier, once a jewel of Roman might in the north, watches its population shrink as merchants move southward, seeking safety. Londinium, once echoing with the tramp of Roman boots, lies half abandoned to mists and myths. Along Hadrian's Wall, the stones remain, but the legions are gone, leaving the northern tribes to wander freely across what was once an unyielding barrier. Yet there is a paradox here. This slow retreat does not erase Rome's spirit, but scatters it like seeds. The children born in these borderlands grow up as both Roman and not, carrying the customs of empire and the fierce freedom of the tribes interwoven within their blood. When they ride to war, they wield swords forged in Roman forges and wear furs from the forests. When they pray, they bow before saints whose names were once whispered in basilicas far to the south. They are the beginning of something new, neither wholly Roman nor wholly barbarian, but a bridge between worlds that will one day blossom into kingdoms of their own. And so, on this frontier, where the empire breathes its last through the weary lungs of soldiers and settlers, we glimpse not merely an ending, but a becoming. The ramparts crumble, the standards sag, Yet in the mingling of blood and tongue and custom, a strange resilience takes root. Here at the world's ragged edge, the ruins of Rome sow the wild fields of tomorrow. So let us step away from these lonely walls tonight, listening to the distant call of a century's horn fading into the dark forest beyond. There is more yet to see, deeper yet to wander. For the final breath of Rome is not merely a sigh of loss, but a whisper that carries forward, into monasteries and kingdoms, into the stories yet to be told by those who will gather, centuries hence, beside new hearths built upon ancient stones. Now the moon rises higher over the scattered remnants of Rome's once unshakable world, and we find ourselves drifting at last toward the hush of its final sigh, a twilight that lingers not only in stone, but in the quiet beating of human hearts that carried the embers onward. For when an empire as vast and proud as Rome dissolves, it does not vanish like a candle snuffed in the dark. It lingers in whispers, ruins, prayers, and dreams, its downfall a seedbed for the centuries to come. In these last drifting moments, we turn our gaze not to generals or emperors, but to the ordinary souls whose small labors and quiet endurance would cradle the fragile light of civilization through the long shadows of what some would call the Dark Ages. For the spirit of Rome, though battered and betrayed by ambition and war, found unlikely shelter among the monks and scribes, the farmers and village elders, the mothers who told old stories to children beneath leaking roofs. In the remote hills of what is now Italy's wild heartland, a cluster of monks gathered in the ruins of old villas and crumbling temples. With calloused hands that once wielded plows or swords, they now tended gardens and vineyards, coaxing stubborn life from neglected soil. By lamplight, they copied fading manuscripts, works of Virgil and Cicero, scraps of law codes and herbal lore, holy texts that bound the new faith to the old tongue of empire. Line by painstaking line, they preserved words that might have otherwise vanished beneath moss and forgetfulness. These monasteries, perched like beacons in the wilderness, became islands of memory. A weary traveler could find shelter there, a meal, a warm fire, a sermon that mingled Roman reason with Christian hope. A sick child might find a remedy brewed from herbs noted in a monk's tattered book. In this way, the wisdom of Rome did not vanish with the legions and senators. It lingered behind monastery walls, hidden from sword and flame, waiting for gentler times. Meanwhile, in fields where marble once gleamed, peasants turned the stones of fallen temples into new walls for cottages and chapels. They borrowed bits of Latin for their prayers and bartered with coins stamped with emperors whose faces they no longer recognized. In quiet villages, elders spoke of the old days, not as a golden age of power and conquest, but as a time when roads were safe and grain was plentiful. These stories were not lamentations, but seeds of longing, a hope that order might return, even if the eagle standards were gone. Far beyond the old heartlands, new kingdoms began to bud like shoots pushing through cracked pavement. Among the Franks, the Visigoths, the Lombards, chieftains stitched scraps of Roman custom into their own rough cloaks of kingship. They issued laws in Latin, crowned themselves with diadems inspired by Caesar's laurels, and hired clerks to keep records in the same script the monks preserved. Their courts rang with strange blends of Roman law and tribal tradition, forging something neither wholly old nor wholly new. This was not Rome as it had been, a vast, ordered empire stretching from misty Britannia to sunlit Syria, but Rome transformed, carried forward in fragments. A road here, a word there, a law carved on a weathered tablet, a church built upon the bones of a temple, and in every fragment a memory that once people believed the world could be bound together by stone, law, and shared tongue. The roads, broken though they were, still guided pilgrims and merchants. A trader carrying wool from the highlands of Britain might follow an ancient Roman bridge across the Rhine, sleeping in the shelter of a crumbling milestone. A wandering scholar might stumble upon an old villa's mosaic floor buried beneath pasture grass and wonder at the hands that laid each tessera so carefully. Each traveler carried away a story, a rumor, a spark. In cities that clung to survival, Rome herself, battered and looted yet stubbornly alive, life continued like a flickering lamp. Fishermen cast their nets from the Tiber's banks. Bakers kneaded bread in shadowed alleys where senators once paraded in silk. Pilgrims came to pray at shrines that mingled the dust of martyrs with the stones of Jupiter's temples. The people of these cities learned to live among ruins, to see beauty in broken columns and half-buried statues peering through ivy. They did not forget who they had been, but neither could they return to what was lost. Perhaps that is the final truth of Rome's fall, that its greatness was not simply in marble triumphs or legions marching in perfect step, but in the stubborn will of people to remember and adapt, to carry forward what pieces they could. An empire of the mind and the spirit, scattered on the winds of time yet rooted wherever people built a hearth and told old stories by its glow. So now, as the stars wheel above lands that once bowed to the Caesars, we stand at the edge of Rome's long goodnight. The last legions are gone, the purple cloaks moth-eaten, and the laurels turned to dust. But in the hush between the falling of empires and the rising of kingdoms, a quiet promise lingers, one that will echo through the scribe's ink, the builder's stones, the prayers murmured in half-ruined churches. It is a promise that order can be born from ruin, that memory can survive the fall of walls, that greatness can scatter into countless seeds to bloom in unexpected soil. And so we drift gently from these ancient roads and broken forums, carrying with us the whispers of Rome, a dream too vast to vanish, too human to ever truly die. Sleep now, beneath the stars that watched legions march and emperors rise and fall. Sleep and let your dreams wander those silent, moonlit ruins, where the past breathes softly still, and where tomorrow waits, ever patient, for the seeds of Rome to rise anew.